Austin started down the hall with his suitcase when he saw Dr. Paulo heading his way. The doctor smiled and nodded his head at Austin and walked straight into him. Austin stopped and looked at Dr. Paulo and was about to say something when the doctor spoke first. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Lieutenant. How clumsy of me." The doctor took Austin's free hand, pretended to shake his hand, and slipped a small glass vial into Austin's hand. "2 drops in Earl's coffee. 1 time. And within 2 hours, our problems will be solved," he whispered. Austin slipped the vial in his right pant pocket and smiled at Dr. Paulo. "No worries, Doctor." Dr. Paulo nodded and continued down the hall. The 3 men sat down at the briefing table in President Paulson's office. The president sat at the head of the table nearest the door to his office, and Austin sat to his left. Philip sat down to the president's right. Both Philip and Austin remained quiet and professional during the briefing. President Paulson's aide, Mr. King, was indisposed, and the president was quite annoyed with this. He looked straight at Austin. "Give me a cup of coffee, will you?" Austin's stomach turned into nerves. This was too good to be true. Austin hid his nervousness and got up and went over to the coffee carafe that was on a cart directly behind the president and right next to the door to his office. He glanced over his shoulder. President Paulson's back was to him, and Philip was not paying any attention to what he was doing. There were not any cameras or recording devices in the president's office, so Austin could add the drops without being seen or recorded. Austin quietly poured coffee into the president's cup. He took the vial out of his pocket and carefully opened the vial. He had to hurry before the president got suspicious over taking so long to pour a cup of coffee. Austin glanced over his shoulder one more time. The president was still facing the other way. Austin quickly put the first drop into President Paulson's coffee, but just as he was putting the second drop from the vial into the president's coffee cup, Mr. King barged into the office unannounced. Mr. King looked directly at Austin and the vial in his hand, and then over at the president. Mr. King hurriedly walked over to President Paulson. Austin quickly put the lid back on and slipped the vial back into his pocket. He had nerves of steel, but could feel his heart race. Mr. King walked up to President Paulson and stood between him and Sergeant Adams. "Don't you use the intercom to come in here anymore, Mr. King?" the president said in an annoyed manner. President Paulson looked over his shoulder towards Austin. "How long does it take you to pour a cup of coffee, Lieutenant Miller?" Mr. King looked over at Austin. "I will fix the president's coffee. I know how he likes it. Just leave the cup there, Lieutenant." Austin nodded and left the cup next to the coffee carafe and sat down next to Philip. Austin remained calm and unaffected on the outside. He took several slow, deep breaths through his nose. That always helped to calm himself down. "Are you going to tell me what you burst into my office for, Mr. King, or are you just going to stand here all day?" "Mr. President, I have urgent news," Mr. King stuttered and pushed his glasses back up to the bridge of his nose. "Spit it out, Mr. King," the president snarled. "Yes, sir. Let me get you some coffee first. You are going to need it." Despite the president's impatience, Mr. King took the time to go over to the coffee cart. Austin watched Mr. King like a hawk. He wondered if Mr. King was going to get another cup and pour a fresh cup. Mr. King looked at the coffee cup and then at Austin. Mr. King smiled at Austin and brought the cup over to President Paulson. "Drink this, sir. It will help you to take this news." He held the cup out to the president. President Paulson grumbled but took the cup and drank the entire cup of coffee and then slammed the cup down on the table. He leaned forward and became so angry at Mr. King that his eyes became almost red. "Tell me now," he yelled. "Yes, sir. The governor of New York is dead." Austin and Philip's mouths dropped open. "What?" President Paulson screamed loudly and stood up. "He can't be dead. That's impossible." President Paulson looked at Mr. King and took a few steps away from the briefing table. He turned and looked at Mr. King. "What happened? How did he die?" President Paulson's body jerked twice. Mr. King was shaking. "They think it was the flu, Mr. President." Mr. King looked at Austin and Philip and then back at President Paulson. Austin and Philip stood up and moved away from the table a few feet and to their left. President Paulson turned in a circle and looked up at the ceiling and flung his arms around. "It's a lie!" He turned and looked at Mr. King, who was visibly shaken. President Paulson laughed. "Ha, ha, ha! His voice was deep and evil. "Androids don't die, Mr. King." A look of shock swept over everyone's faces. No one dared to say a word. President Paulson was about to say something when he suddenly cried out in pain, "Ah!" and put his hand to his stomach. He managed to move closer to the table and grab onto the back of one of the chairs. He looked at Mr. King. "What did you put in my coffee?" President Paulson groaned grotesquely. "Ugh." Then he fell to the floor. He writhed in pain and held onto his stomach. He looked up at Mr. King. "How is it that I am feeling pain?" His eyes were full of fear. Dr. Paolo was one that went to bed early. He was sound asleep when there was a loud knock on his door. He got out of bed as quickly as he could, grabbed his robe to put over his pajamas, and answered the door. He opened the door after taking a breath and letting it out slowly. Had Lieutenant Austin Miller turned him in? He sighed in relief as he saw Sergeant Cooper. "What is going on, Sergeant Cooper? Come in, please." Sergeant Cooper entered Dr. Paolo's quarters and closed the door behind him. He looked around and spoke in a hushed voice. "President Paulson has taken ill, and we need you to fly out to Washington, D.C. Stat. Austin requested you. I have a private plane ready for takeoff. I will be flying out with you and another agent." Dr. Paolo was nervous and words escaped him, so he simply nodded and rushed to get dressed. A few minutes later, he came back from the bathroom, picked up his black doctor's bag, and followed Sergeant Cooper. A GUV, also known as a government utility vehicle, was waiting on the main level parking lot for them. The driver drove them outside into the back of the facility, where an old but well-maintained road was used for the presidential plane and the other 3 planes that were housed at the facility that were used by the SMU agents. Sergeant Cooper escorted Dr. Paolo onto the SMU plane and helped him to get situated in his seat, and then sat down next to him and buckled his own seatbelt. There was an agent that was sitting in the row behind them and looking down at a map. Once the door was closed and the plane started down the runway, the agent looked up. Dr. Paolo glanced over at him. "Special Agent Fisher, how nice to see that you will be joining us on our little trip." Dr. Paolo felt relieved and smiled at Frank. Frank grinned at Dr. Paolo and Sergeant Cooper. "Thank you. I am happy to be on board. No pun intended." Frank was grateful that Sergeant Cooper called him and asked him to come in for a special and very important mission. Dr. Paolo looked at Sergeant Cooper. "Who is our pilot and co-pilot?" Sergeant Cooper smiled. He knew that Dr. Paolo was making sure that everyone on the plane could be trusted. "Agent Jerome Santos." Dr. Paolo absent-mindedly nodded and did a quick double look at Sergeant Cooper. "He knows how to fly a plane?" Sergeant Cooper laughed. He patted Dr. Paolo's shoulder. "Relax, you're in good hands. Jerome has been flying small planes for 20 years. He used to help his family on their farm in Puerto Rico by dusting crops when he was 17. Dr. Paolo nodded and closed his eyes and held on tightly to his small black bag that was on his lap. Frank looked at Sergeant Cooper and whispered, "Should we tell him that there's no co-pilot?" Dr. Paolo's eyes opened quickly. Sergeant Cooper looked at Frank, stifled a laugh, shook his head, and then turned back around. He spoke without looking at the doctor. "Don't worry, Dr. Paolo, I know how to fly a plane." Dr. Paolo barely turned his head towards Sergeant Cooper, nodded, and then closed his eyes again. Frank and Austin stepped forward after Dr. Clark left. Frank looked at the instrument that Dr. Paolo was holding. Dr. Paolo changed a few settings and held the instrument up to President Paulson's head. Austin stepped forward. "Dr. Paolo, what is Paulson's prognosis?" Dr. Paolo looked at Austin and said quietly, "He is gone." Austin and the others remained silent for a few minutes while Dr. Paolo reached behind President Paulson's left ear, parted his hair, and pressed on the skin covering the mastoid section of the skull. The skin, which was not real skin at all, parted and a microchip came out of a built-in slot. Dr. Paolo held up the small microchip. "This gentleman is President Paulson." Dr. Paolo handed the microchip to Austin, who inadvertently made a face and wished that he had been wearing gloves, while Dr. Paolo took a small microchip holder out of his bag. He turned to Austin and took the microchip from him and placed it in the holder. He looked at the men in the room. "Who wants to be the holder of President Paulson?" All of the men made faces, and none of the men volunteered. Dr. Paolo shrugged his shoulders and said, "I guess I will be the holder of President Paulson." Austin spoke up. Shouldn't we destroy that, Doctor? Dr. Paolo shook his head. There's a lot of valuable information on this microchip. It contains the fingerprint of the person or persons who made Paulson and perhaps had him put in office. The men looked at each other. It was more serious than they had thought. Philip wanted to hear confirmation. So what are you saying, Doctor? Is that someone made Paulson and programmed him to be an evil president? Austin winced. Philip made it sound that they were all in some bad horror movie. Dr. Paolo looked at Philip. If you can bring me to a safe computer, then I can show you and explain it much better. Sergeant Cooper spoke up. Will a laptop work? I have mine with me. He held up the case as if to show everybody. Dr. Paolo answered, Sure, this is the 4th millennium after all. Everyone followed Sergeant Cooper and Dr. Paolo over to the small table that was in the infirmary, and Sergeant Cooper set his laptop down on the table, remained standing, leaned over, and booted it up. Dr. Paolo sat down in the chair in front of the laptop and looked at Sergeant Cooper. Do you have a scrambling program on here? Sergeant Cooper nodded. He leaned over Dr. Paolo's shoulder and brought up the scrambling program and activated it. Dr. Paolo nodded and inserted the microchip into the docking slot that was located on the right side of the computer. In less than a minute, a program popped up. Sergeant Cooper looked at Dr. Paolo. I didn't know that my computer could do that. Dr. Paolo smiled at Sergeant Cooper. It's in the software on the microchip. Philip looked at Dr. Paolo. Will whomever it was that created the beast be able to tell that we are accessing the microchip? Dr. Paolo answered, They would if we did not have a scrambling program. Philip nodded. A very complex chart appeared on the computer. In vertical waves, it showed the outline of President Paulson's form. Dr. Paolo clicked on the brain center part of the graph. Several pages loaded. Dr. Paolo scrolled through the pages. This gentleman is President Paulson's programming. Frank leaned forward. All I see are numbers. Correct, Dr. Paolo stated. This information is coded. It would take maybe months or even years for us to decipher it all, unless we had a mainframe computer. Sergeant Cooper looked at Dr. Paolo. What can you tell us now? Dr. Paolo went back to the previous screen and clicked on the skull and used the control key to change the image to a side view of Paulson's skull. He then clicked on the lower back portion of the skull, on the occipital bone. As the computer visual passed through the skull and went deeper into the left hemisphere of President Paulson's brain, a mathematical sequence appeared. Dr. Paolo looked at the men, leaned back in his chair and smiled and crossed his arms. Watch. He turned his attention back to the computer. Layer after layer of mathematical sequences appeared. Once they reached the 21st sequence, the computer started to slow down. Symbols appeared on the screen that only Dr. Paolo recognized. He took a breath and let it out slowly as he said, look at that, gentlemen. That is what is known as the 5th dimension of the android brain. All the men leaned forward and furrowed their brows, trying to understand what they were seeing. Dr. Paolo watched the screen until it stopped loading. He took his finger and pointed it at the lower right portion of the screen. And this, gentlemen, is the fingerprint of President Paulson's creator. Frank looked over at the body of President Paulson and held his breath. He looked at Dr. Paolo. I don't mean to interrupt, but there's a beeping sound coming from Paulson's body. Dr. Paolo looked at Paulson and listened. Everybody quick, drop down to the floor and take cover. He's going to... Before Dr. Paolo could finish his sentence, they heard 3 fast clicks, and then there was a sudden explosion. Philip shrugged his shoulders and looked at Austin. I don't know, but what if I am a hybrid, and I just don't know? Look at Corporal Faith. He didn't know. Austin smiled at Philip. Frank stepped closer to Austin and looked at him. Austin held up the scrambler. Well, there's a simple way that we can find out, my friend. Philip looked at Austin and then at the scrambler. He nodded his head. Austin smiled and said, Okay, I am going to turn on the scrambler and then I am going to say something. If you can hear me, you are fully human. Do you understand? Philip nodded. If you can't, then you are either a hybrid or a full android, Austin explained. Philip said, Okay. Austin grinned and turned the scrambler on while Philip and Frank watched. Austin moved his lips as though he were speaking. Frank looked at Austin's mouth. Philip looked at Austin in horror. Oh my God, I can't hear what you are saying. Philip screamed and turned away from the men and put his hands to his head. Frank looked at Austin blankly. I didn't hear anything either. Austin burst out laughing and Philip quickly swung around and stared at him. I just found out that I am not human and you are laughing? Philip yelled. Man, you are so gullible. You can hear me talking now, right? Yeah, Philip nodded. Austin pointed to the scrambler. It's still on. Frank caught on to Austin's joke and hit Austin in the ribs with his elbow. That was mean, Austin. Frank turned around and covered his mouth to stifle a laugh. Austin looked at Philip. I was joking with you, Philip. Philip looked at Austin and then at the scrambler and then at Frank, who was not hiding very well that he was laughing. Philip looked at Austin again and burst out laughing. Frank turned around and let his laughter out, and he and Austin and Philip had a good laugh for a while. Philip walked over to the end of the bed and sat down. Man, that was mean, Austin. Hey, you pinched me in Paulson's office to see if I had human skin. You had that coming. Frank looked at Austin. He pinched you? Austin nodded. Frank looked at Philip and pointed to Austin. You really pinched him? Yeah, I wanted to see if he had human skin. It's a long story. Philip leaned back on the bed and laughed and then sat up again. I can't believe I fell for your joke. He looked at Austin. But you have to admit that it was funny, Austin said with a smile. Philip nodded. Yeah, it was pretty funny. Milt and Austin hung out a few more hours, and then Austin went back to his quarters. He took out his private phone, sat on his bed, and looked through his photo gallery. He still had all of the pictures of him and Sasha. Austin laid back on his bed and looked up Sasha in his phone contacts. He paused a moment and then called her. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up. Hello? Sasha. Austin, why are you calling me? Austin smiled. It was good to hear her voice again. He thought of her big, beautiful brown eyes and her beautiful, soft, dark skin. I wanted to talk to you and see how you are doing. Sasha was silent for a moment. I'm doing okay, considering. But South City was not hit, so things are somewhat normal around here. Are you dating anyone, or did you get married? No. Austin sighed silently in relief. I never stopped loving you, Sasha. Austin, we haven't talked in 2 years. That was not my choice. You could have called or sent me a text once in a while, Sasha said quietly. I didn't want to hurt you, and it was too hard. Sasha remained silent. How do you like where you are living? Austin asked. I don't know, it's the same old apartment that it was 2 years ago. Maybe you should think about moving. Where would I move to, Austin? How about Washington, D.C.? Austin, I don't know anyone in Washington, D.C. Austin smiled. Have you heard the news about President Paulson? I did. That was wild. He looked healthy to me. I think he was murdered. Austin laughed through his nose. Austin, what's so funny about that? Austin looked at the ceiling. It's a long story. I will tell you another time. Sasha, President Sayers asked me to be on his security team and on a special task force. Austin, that's great. I am happy for you. Congratulations. I'm thinking of getting married. What? I am thinking of getting married and bringing her with me to D.C. There was dead silence for almost a minute on the phone. Sasha? Is that why you really called me for, Austin, to tell me that you are getting married? Oh, I wasn't good enough for you, but you can go and find some hoe and marry her and bring her with you? Austin laughed. I don't think that's very funny, Austin. I don't hear from you in 2 years, and you have to call me and throw it in my face that you are going to marry some hoe. Sasha. Sasha kept going on and did not hear Austin say her name. Sasha. What? Sasha said loudly. You're still in love with me, aren't you? What do you care? You are gonna go and marry some hoe, and you call me up and have the nerve to tell me about it, and then to add insult to injury, you ask me, tell me that I am still in love with you? Well, Austin asked. Well, what? Sasha asked, annoyed. Are you still in love with me? Austin, you know I never got over you. That's why I haven't dated or looked at anyone since I told you to leave. Then why did you tell me to leave? You know why. You just wanted to shack up and treat me like I do not matter. Like I wasn't good enough to marry. Sasha, you were good enough to marry. I just wasn't ready for it. So, I am now. What? Sasha, I want to marry you. I want you to come to D.C. with me. You're gonna dump that hoe and marry me and bring me to D.C.? Austin laughed. Sasha, there is no one else. I have not dated anyone since we broke up, not even one date. What? Then why did you let me go on believing that you were dating and going to marry some hoe? Austin smiled. Sasha, I am asking you to take me back, marry me, and move to D.C. with me. Well, alright. I'm in Nevada right now. How soon can you be ready? Frank got out of the car and walked into the terminal and towards the checkout counter. He was so busy looking at the e-ticket on his phone that he did not see that the blonde-haired woman in line in front of him had suddenly stopped, and he ran right into her. Oh, excuse me, Frank said. The woman did not look at Frank but said, no worries. She checked in and left in a hurry without even looking at Frank. Frank watched her walk off, and then he checked in and found out that they were already boarding passengers on the plane. He made it to the gate just in time. Frank got on the plane and found his window seat. He loved the layout of the new 2-seat per side planes. He had never been on one before, but he had heard about them on the news. There was a woman already sitting down in the aisle seat. It was the blonde woman that he had run into at the checkout counter. Frank did not want to be rude and climb over her, so he looked at her and asked, would you mind terribly letting me through? Frank asked politely. Frank noticed that the woman had earbuds in and probably did not hear him. He was about to ask her again when the stewardess tapped him on the shoulder and said, would you mind taking your seat, sir? We are about to take off. Frank nodded and looked at the blonde-haired woman that was seated. Now she had her head in a book in addition to the earbuds. Okay, lady, which do you want, my backside or my front side in your face? The woman looked up at him shocked. I beg your pardon? Frank's mouth dropped open. He pointed to earbud. President Paulson sat at the head of the medium-sized mahogany conference table that was in his office with his top aide, Mr. Bill King, who sat next to him to his left. The president seemed to be in a jovial mood as his aide told him about the recent bombings by the CPAC via the TCAP. That's all of the information that I have for you right now, sir. The short, balding aide set down his stack of papers on his lap and folded his hands. Keeping all expression from his face, he looked at President Paulson and waited for a response. The president smiled and took a deep breath. Good information, Mr. King. President Paulson leaned forward towards Mr. King and smiled almost hypnotically. Tell me, have there been any more bombing since the initial bombings 3 weeks ago? Mr. King adjusted his thick, black-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat, and without realizing it, he smiled back at the president. No, sir, I am happy to say that as far as our information tells us, there have been no further bombings or attacks on the major cities infiltrated with TOR members. President Paulson slammed his fist down hard on the mahogany table. Happy? You're happy to report that there have been no more attacks by the CPAC? Mr. King got a little nervous and picked up and shuffled the papers from his lap and then set them down on the table. I can check my information and sources again, sir. His stomach turned as he realized that he forgot to hide his true feelings from the president and monitor his words carefully. He looked at the president timidly and repeated, I can check my information and sources again, sir. Mr. King's voice shook as he spoke softly. The president said gruffly, no. Mr. King withheld all emotion from his face by forcing his mind to ignore his true feelings about the president. President Paulson looked carefully at Mr. King. Was he a traitor? Paulson opened his mouth to say something, paused for a moment, and then took a long, slow breath and leaned back in his chair. As he spoke, he toned down his voice from a controlled rage to a syrupy, sweet tone. No, don't bother checking, Mr. King. I know that your stats are always impeccable and well-researched. President Paulson rested his left hand against the side of his face with his index finger reaching to his temple. He lightly tapped his index finger against his temple, as though it helped him to think. It was a habit that only his staff had noticed. And although his voice remained controlled when he spoke, his face still had a reddish tone that was present when he was quite angry. His red face was quite a contrast to his graying black hair. "Leave those documents with me, Mr. King." President Paulson leaned forward and pointed toward the papers that Mr. King was once again holding. "You may go back to your office now." "Yes, sir." Mr. King handed the documents to President Paulson and quietly left the room. President Paulson looked at the information again and scowled. He stood up abruptly and took the papers over to his desk and sat down. He set the papers down on his rich mahogany wood desk and leaned back in his large, comfortable black leather chair. He folded his arms and lightly rocked his chair forward and back. He stared at the wall across the room as though he were watching a movie. A few minutes later, President Paulson leaned forward and rested his forearms on his desk and took another look at the documents. A look of anger arose upon his expression that turned so dark that his face looked contorted. He crumpled the papers in his hands into an unrecognizable wad and stared straight ahead again. His gaze was almost catatonic and lasted for several minutes before his trance was finally broken. He smiled a mischievous smile and became relaxed in his chair. As he leaned back, he smiled again. His eyes seemed to flash brightly for a moment as he thought of a brilliant plan to restart the fighting between the CPAC and TOR. His eyes glowed an amber yellow for a moment and then returned to their normal dark brown color. Paulson turned his swivel chair so that he was facing toward his right. He held a crumpled ball of papers in the palm of his left hand and held his right hand over the small, dark gray metal trash can that sat next to his desk. He grinned wildly and stared at the ball of paper intently. His eyes once again glowed an amber yellow, but far brighter this time. Within moments, the paper slowly started to smolder in his hand and then caught fire. He held onto it for a moment and then smiled sinisterly as he casually dropped the burning papers into the trash can and watched them burn. President Paulson wiped the ash from his hand on a black handkerchief that he retrieved from the left inside pocket of his black suit jacket. The flames had not harmed him. He smirked and placed the handkerchief on the left side of his desk. He leaned forward to rest his hands on the center of his desk for a moment before picking up the phone. Mr. King tapped lightly on the closed door to the president's office. He waited for a response. The president hit the intercom button. "Come in." Mr. King shivered as he heard the president's voice next to his ear through the intercom speaker. He slowly opened the door. The president seemed to be in a jovial mood. Mr. King kept silent, gave the president a small, pretty smile, and approached his desk. The president glanced at the paper that Mr. King was holding in his left hand. "What is this?" Mr. King cleared his throat. "I'm afraid that I have some bad news, sir." President Paulson took the document from Mr. King, and before he looked at it, his demeanor changed. His tone of voice became tense. "You may be dismissed, Mr. King." "Thank you." Mr. King nodded, and he headed towards the door at such a fast pace that he looked as though he were speed walking. He clumsily opened the door, exited, and closed the door behind him as quickly as he could. He did not want to be within 10 feet of the door when the president read the information that was in the document. The secret meeting. Several days later, in the middle of the day, President Paulson and 4 of his men from the specialized military unit were meeting in a field under a grove of trees in a wilderness park area about 30 miles southeast of Los Angeles and 25 miles northeast of South City. They were all wearing black suits, white dress shirts, and black military boots. Each man wore a small rectangular red pin on their left lapel. President Paulson looked at one of the SMUA specialized military unit agents that was standing to his left. At 6'3", the man was the tallest of the 4 men, with light blonde hair that was cut in a short military crew cut. Paulson was about to say something to the man, but decided to look at the road that they had just traveled on before saying anything. Once he saw that the road was empty, with no vehicles in sight, he looked at the agent again. "What time will he be here, Blonde? I cannot stand here by this car under the trees all day. We have been here for 30 minutes. I don't tolerate being kept waiting." President Paulson looked at his watch and then crossed his arms. "Are we early, or is he late?" Agent Mike Plum, who was 34 years of age and of medium build, was known to be a man who was very loyal to the president and was very devoted to his job. He was meticulous and wanted everything to be perfect and to run smoothly. Agent Plum took off his sunglasses to look at his watch. His turquoise eyes were almost translucent. "We were 15 minutes early, sir. We were to meet him at 11 a.m. He is almost 15 minutes late now, sir." Plum put his dark sunglasses back on as his eyes were slightly sensitive to sunlight, something that he had always been able to hide from the president, who required perfection of all his SMU agents. Before President Paulson could say anything else, a large white unmarked box truck came into view from over the horizon. One of the other men, Agent Neil Jones, 42 years of age, also medium build, but shorter than the others at 5 foot 10 inches, with thick, dark brown, wavy hair, dark brown eyes, and a small, well-groomed mustache, pointed at the far horizon of the road and spoke up. "There's a white truck coming this way, sir," Agent Jones said in a calm manner. "I can see that, Mr. Jones." The president did nothing to hide his annoyance at Agent Jones. Agent Jones' face turned red. "Yes, sir. My apologies." He took a step back as if to hide. The men waited in silence for the truck to approach the area and park adjacent to President Paulson's black limo. A short, overweight man named Leonard Burns, who was in his late 40s with gray eyes and unruly, dark brown hair, got out of the driver's side of the box truck. He was holding a clipboard with papers on it, and he had a cigar in his mouth. He wore a white t-shirt and a white baseball cap that barely fit his head, making his curly hair stick out even more. He had on dark gray slacks and wore dirty tan boots. He glanced at the men and then spoke up. His voice was gruff. "I've got your order, Mr. President." Leonard pulled a small stack of papers, which were 4 pages stapled together, off the clipboard and held the papers out in front of him. "I've got 4 coordinates here for delivery, as requested." President Paulson snickered. "Is that what they're calling them these days?" He winked and smiled at Leonard sinisterly. Leonard smiled back, oblivious to President Paulson's evil intent behind his sinister smile. Agent Plum took the papers from the driver and looked at them before handing them to President Paulson. "Everything seems to be in order, sir." The president looked the papers over briefly and then handed them back to Agent Plum, while Leonard went back to the back of the truck and opened the white painted metal roll-up door. Once the door was opened completely, Leonard pulled down the metal plank that went from the truck to the ground, which he walked slowly up, as though he was climbing up the side of a steep mountain. He quickly opened 4 tall crates with a crowbar. He stood next to one of the coordinates, pointed at it, and looked at the group of men below. "You want me to unload these unactivated, or should I switch them on?" he asked. President Paulson gave another sinister smile to Leonard. "Activate them, but put them in standby mode. You may activate them in the truck to save yourself from keeping them in the crates and using a hand truck." After several minutes, all the coordinates were activated and in standby mode. Leonard looked at President Paulson. "Do you want a call command list for these guys?" President Paulson glared and spoke with a slow and deliberate tone. "No, I know what all of the commands are." He looked at the coordinates and said, "Bene Sate, come here." The coordinates, who were all dressed in black suits with white dress shirts and black dress shoes, walked down the plank slowly with purpose, and out, one after the other, until all 4 were standing in front of President Paulson. Agent Jones' mouth dropped open and he whispered aloud to himself, "They look like the governors of—" He stopped himself short of finishing the sentence when he noticed that Agent Plum had turned around and glared at him. Agent Jones could hardly believe that Agent Plum, who was at least 12 feet from him, was able to hear him. He had spoken just below a normal whisper. President Paulson walked around the coordinates and looked them over briefly and smiled with satisfaction. "They will do." Paulson looked at Leonard. "Remember to tell no one what you have seen." Paulson gave Leonard a look that could peel the paint off of a wall. "You may be dismissed." Leonard got a momentary look of fear and nodded to the president. He bit harder on his cigar as he hurried back to his truck, closed the back of the truck, and got into the driver's seat and drove off without saying a word. Agent Plum, along with another of President Paulson's men, Agent Rick Fields, who was 6 foot tall, 52 years old, with red hair and blue eyes, opened the center doors of the limo. Agents Plum and Fields stood on each side of the limo, which was an extra long stretch limo and had a double back seat, as well as a double center seat. President Paulson looked at Agent Plum. "Agent Plum, we will fully activate the coordinates when we get back to the facility and they have been checked out thoroughly. The president looked at the group of coordinates and spoke in a loud command. Bene Sate, get into the car. The group of coordinates did as they were ordered and walked over to the limousine and got in. Their eyes, while they looked real, had a glassy look to them. President Paulson followed close behind them and stood next to the limo. He knew that once they were powered on completely, their eyes would look like every other human's eyes. Agent Plum stood close to the president and talked to him quietly for a few minutes. While the coordinates were getting into the car, the fourth agent who was present, Agent Frank Fisher, pulled Agent Neil Jones aside and spoke as softly as he could. Jones, if you want to stay alive, you need to keep your mouth shut. Do you understand me? Look, Neil, we have known each other for a long time, and I do not want to see anything bad happen to you. Get it? Agent Jones looked shaken but nodded his head. I can't believe that I messed up, he said as he looked at his friend. You know me, Frank. I always keep my mouth shut, even when I'm in field duty. Dr. Kahlo peered into the open door of the limo and looked at the coordinates. He looked back at the president and smiled. These are fine specimens. They will do nicely, but I will certainly test out every facet of them. President Paulson took a step closer to the scientist and spoke at a low volume. I need them by the end of the month. As you know, they will be taking over for the governor's positions in California, Utah, Oregon, and Washington State. Then once they have proven themselves, we will go on from there. Make sure to turn off their auto-update sectors. We don't need them getting a mind of their own and taking over. President Paulson laughed. A quiet but deep laugh and smiled deviously. Brilliant, Mr. President. Absolutely brilliant, Dr. Kahlo laughed. Then turned and spoke the alert command to the coordinates, which automatically went into sleep mode after 5 minutes when they were on standby mode. Bene Sate, alert! Bene Sate, follow me. The coordinates got out of the limousine and silently followed Dr. Kahlo. Before Frank could say anything, they heard the buzzer that meant that the door behind them was being accessed. Both agents turned to look as two SMU field agents walked through the door and stood just past the doorway. Agent Jones recognized them both. The man on the left was a dark-skinned man of African descent and was 38 years old and 6 foot 4 inches tall. He had big, dark brown eyes and a smooth-shaved head. His name badge was attached to the left pocket of his well-pressed field uniform, which was a black military uniform with a red stripe down the outside of both pant legs. The name badge was blue and displayed the name Lieutenant Austin Miller. Austin was very muscular and of medium-large build. The man on the left was 39 and 6 foot 1 inches tall. He had sandy blonde hair and blue eyes. He had pale skin and was of average build. He was also wearing a field uniform, with his name badge clipped to his left front uniform pocket, displaying the name of Sergeant Philip Adams. Lieutenant Miller looked directly at Agent Jones. Agent Neil Jones, come with us. Neil's heart started pounding as he did his best to hide the look of fear on his face. He felt like all of the blood drained from his body. He had hoped that he had more time. He did not even have a chance to call and talk to Elizabeth one last time. He knew that he was a marked man, but he did not know that he would be taken care of at the facility and so soon. He took a shallow breath and answered the lieutenant, Yes, sir. He walked gravely toward the men. He was careful to not look back at Agent Fisher so that the men would not get suspicious that he knew anything about what was happening. Although there was a slight possibility that they had already suspected, he was hoping still that President Paulson thought nothing of his and Agent Fisher's earlier conversation. Agent Fisher looked on helplessly, making sure to show absolutely no emotion as he watched his friend being taken away. He watched for a moment and then turned and faced the limousine. The men took Agent Jones down the main corridor into the brass elevator. All Neil could do was think of his wife Elizabeth and their unborn daughter, and to remind himself to breathe. He felt faint and sick to his stomach. He had always been a little less tough than the other SMU men, but he thought that he was made of more than this. It was anguishing to feel such deep fear, knowing what was going to happen to him. Every fiber of his being wanted to fight and flee, but there was no way of escape now. He could never fight off Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Adams and escape the facility. All three of the men had been in the SMU agency together, and Field Agent Lieutenant Austin Miller kicked his butt every time. And while Field Agent Sergeant Philip Adams wasn't an exceptionally strong man, he was far stronger than Neil, and the only time that Neil had ever beat him in fighting and wrestling matches at the academy was by outwitting him with his mind, not out of physical strength. The elevator finally arrived at the main floor and the three men got in. Sergeant Adams pressed the elevator button for basement level 3, which was the farthest floor underneath the building. No one spoke a word or looked at each other. After what seemed to be an eternity to Neil, the elevator stopped, the doors opened, and the three men got off the elevator. Sergeant Adams pushed the door open, and he, Lieutenant Miller, and Agent Jones walked through the doorway and into another long hallway that led to a large, dark warehouse. The warehouse was wider in length than in width, and had row after row of metal supply shelves filled with boxes, canned food, and other supplies. Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Adams led Neil to the very last row of shelves and stopped. The warehouse was eerily quiet. Neil was deep in thought about his family and too numb to feel afraid anymore, although his breathing was still labored. He thought about his latest mistake and all of the little things that he seemed to have done to irritate President Paulson over the past several weeks. Lieutenant Miller and Sergeant Adams changed positions from standing next to Neil to standing directly in front of him. Lieutenant Miller stepped close to Neil, too close. Lieutenant Miller's nose was almost touching Neil's forehead as Lieutenant Miller bent down to say something to him. Neil looked up. He looked squarely at Lieutenant Miller. Fear started to fill his mind again, and his heart started to race faster. He kept silent. He refused to show any fear. He wondered how it was going to be done. Would they end his life with a quickly broken neck? Or with a gunshot? No, that was too messy, Neil thought to himself. Listen carefully, Lieutenant Miller spoke, and then stepped away and went to the shelf to his right and bent down. He reached his hand to the back of the shelf and pulled out something blue and pressed it to Neil's chest. Put this on. Neil looked confused. What is it? Lieutenant Miller answered, making sure to keep his voice down. It's a TCAP pilot's uniform. It is fire retardant. Just in case. Neil looked at Lieutenant Miller and then the uniform and then back at Lieutenant Miller again. Just in case of what? I do not understand. I thought that you were sent to kill me. Neil took the uniform. Are you going to kill me in this wrinkled thing? He held up the crumpled uniform and pressed it against Lieutenant Miller's chest. Lieutenant Miller looked serious. Sure, Agent Jones, that way we can say that you were a TCAP pilot working for CCAP and you broke in here so we had cause to kill you. Neil nodded and looked at Lieutenant Miller's chest. Lieutenant Miller laughed. Would you just trust me to put the darn suit on? We are trying to save your life here. Hurry up, man. The supply truck will be here any minute. Just put it over your own clothes. No one is bothering the CPAC or TCAP right now. If anyone in the public sees you in that pilot's uniform, they will leave you alone, unless you come across a tour member. Then you had better fight like hell. Lieutenant Miller laughed again. Neil's fear turned him to astonishment and then to giddiness. He took his boots off and slipped into the suit and zipped it up. Why a pilot's uniform? I don't know how to fly a plane or a helicopter. Neil sat down on the ground. While he was sitting on the ground putting his boots back on, Lieutenant Miller explained. A TCAP pilot's uniform was the only CPAC uniform that we could get. You are one lucky dog that Philip and I got the orders to kill you, not someone else. Philip smiled. Neil looked up at Austin and Philip. You two are putting yourselves in a lot of danger doing this for me. Neil finished tying his boots and stood up. Philip looked at Neil and smiled. I guess that we can trust you, since I'm sure that you will no longer be loyal to the SMU or to the president. Austin and I are undercover agents for an elite group that banded together a month after President Paulson took office. We are all ex-military men. We were called into action by former President Sayers. Austin added, Sayers knew something was not right about Paulson and got this group together. Neil looked at Austin. I need to tell you guys what I saw today, the reason that I was to be terminated. Austin smiled. I was hoping that you would have some information for us. He glanced over at Philip and then back at Neil. And as you know, this warehouse is unmonitored. We made sure to black out all the cameras that used to be active in here so we can speak freely. I have suspicions that President Paulson is an android. I think that my partner Frank Fisher does too, only he is smart enough to keep his mouth shut. You've seen the way that Paulson's eyes glow an amber color when he is angry, haven't you? Austin nodded. We have, Philip spoke calmly. We all had our suspicions of that too, as well as Sayers. We have not figured out if Paulson is acting alone or if a person or persons are behind him, though. Sayers never said anything during the elections because he wanted to stay alive. But when Vice President Ridge had that unfortunate accident shortly after Paulson took office, he decided to take some action. What kind of man kills off his own vice president? Man? Austin laughed. More like android. Austin looked directly into Neil's eyes. It is on the down low that Sayers knows anything about this. We need to keep him alive. He can take temporary office when we get rid of Paulson. Neil looked at Philip and Austin. You haven't heard the worst of it. He just picked up a shipment today and brought it here to the lab. Hey, how are you going to explain my body disappearing? Man, you should know me by now. What did they call me in the academy? Austin pointed to his own chest. The answer man, Neil smiled. That's right, I am the answer man. I always have a solution to every problem and an answer to everything. Austin grinned as he spoke in an even lower tone than he was speaking before, to spare Greg from the gruesome details. We have a third KAIA man here at this facility. His name is Jerome Santos. He comes from a nice Puerto Rican family and he is very trustworthy. He made a dummy body. He wheeled it into the green room in the wheelchair, shot it, and then wheeled it into the trash room. He burned it up in the incinerator. He did a great job making it look like you, and he did it in less than 15 minutes. Austin looked at Neil and continued. He used your ID image and printed out a rubber mask and used a wig that was in the trunk that he used to use as a disguise before. He used to work in the movies doing special effects. Anyone looking at camera footage or if anyone passing by caught sight of him and your double, no one would be the wiser. In fact, knowing Agent Sanchez, I am sure that he had witnesses so that everyone would know that you were properly taken care of. Austin smiled at Neil. You owe him a suit, by the way. I'm Sergeant Cooper. He held out his hand over his desk and shook Frank's hand. He continued, I understand, Agent Fisher, that your partner was Agent Neil Jones? Frank thought quickly, and the word was seemed to echo in his mind. Was? I'm sorry, I thought that someone had told you Agent Jones had an unfortunate accident. He was throwing something away in the incinerator and fell in. Frank almost threw up. He grabbed onto the chair arms. He knew that Neil did not have an accident. He believed the part about the incinerator and Neil ending up there, though. Frank had hoped that Neil had been dead before being thrown in it. Frank leaned back in his chair and clenched his teeth. He was afraid that if he opened his mouth that he would throw up. Was his friend alive and conscious when they threw him in? Or was he just knocked unconscious? Frank's thoughts tormented him. Frank leaned forward for a moment but was unable to speak and leaned back in his chair again and stared blankly at the sergeant. He could not talk, even if he had tried. Frank felt the tears sting his eyes, but he held them back very well, and he was almost certain that Sergeant Cooper could not tell, or so he thought. Sergeant Cooper looked at Frank. I'm sorry. I know how close we can get to our military partners. Frank felt beyond ill. He looked around the office and noticed a water cooler in the front corner that he had not seen when he came in. He knew that Neil would be terminated, but being terminated so violently had never entered his mind. Frank finally was able to gain some composure enough to speak. Do you mind if I get some water? If you stay seated. I will get it for you. Sergeant Cooper got up and took a paper cup and filled it with cool water and handed it to Frank. Frank took a few sips. Thank you. He rested the cup on his lap to help hide the fact that his hands were shaking. Sergeant Cooper went back to his chair and sat down. I have some questions for you, Agent Fisher. Are you up to it, or do you need a few more minutes? Frank took another sip of water. I'm fine. Fire away. Sergeant Cooper looked at his clipboard. I see that you have quite an extensive background in government service. Frank nodded. He felt numb. Yes, sir. Have you ever thought of serving as a field agent for the SMU? Frank looked at Sergeant Cooper. He felt confused. He thought that he was going to be interrogated about his conversation with Neil earlier. No, sir, I haven't, to be honest. Your name came up in a meeting today with the president. He highly recommended you for a special assignment that we need extra men on. He has allowed me to release you of your duty to him and to join us. That was very kind of him, Frank looked at the sergeant. I would be honored. Frank still felt a gnawing suspicion in his gut. He did not trust President Paulson and wondered if he were being sent on a dangerous mission where he would be killed in the line of duty to help explain the sudden deaths of 2 SMU agents. Frank pushed back all thoughts of Neil. He needed to focus. We have a briefing at 1500 today in the Marks room. I will have a Corporal Faith bring you to your new quarters and provide you with a uniform. Frank was momentarily grateful that he did not have any family waiting for him at his apartment. Sergeant Cooper looked at Frank. What do you know about ants, Agent Fisher? Ants, sir? Yes, ants. Frank sat back in his chair, still holding his water cup on his lap. I know that they crawl all over everything. They do, but specifically I'm talking about scout ants. Sergeant Cooper watched Frank's expression carefully. Scout ants, sure. They're the ones that go out a few at a time to check things out for their colony. Sergeant Cooper smiled. Very good, Special Agent Frank Fisher. Frank raised an eyebrow. Special Agent, sir? That is your new title. Sergeant Cooper leaned back in his chair, smiled, and folded his arms. Tell me, Special Agent Fisher, what's really going on? He leaned forward and put his elbows on his desk. Frank knew better than to trust anyone. I don't know what you mean, Sergeant Cooper. Frank kept a poker face on. He was almost sure this was a test or a trap. That was old school. Get someone's favor, make them feel comfortable with you, like you are an instant buddy or comrade. Then the trap is set. For one, you have been friends with Agent Jones for quite some time. Tell me, Special Agent Fisher, does Agent Jones seem the type that would be so clumsy as to fall into an incinerator? Sergeant Cooper gave a crooked smile that appeared to be a half smile and a half frown. Frank could not read Sergeant Cooper the way that he could read most people. As much as he wanted to scream, no, he kept his cool. I'm afraid he was a bit clumsy, sir. Dr. Clark looked quite serious. Gentlemen, I don't want to tell you how to do your jobs, but we have a situation here. Had this been a normal presidency, we would have a protocol for this. I can assure you that the president is not going to make it. And even if he did, we all know that an android or a hybrid android cannot be president. We have no military that can step in and assist. We have no vice president. He looked at Austin and Philip, but I know how loyal the SMU are to President Paulson. Philip looked at Dr. Clark. Then why are you trusting us with this information? We could take you out like that. Philip snapped his fingers and continued speaking. Then the truth about Paulson would stay in the Black House. Austin looked at Dr. Clark. Your personal position, how did you not know that the president was an android? He looked amused. He looked at Austin's name badge. Lieutenant Miller. What I have is a title, not a job. Dr. Clark leaned against a chair. Dr. Paolo in California attended to all of the president's medical needs. I am just here for show. Dr. Clark took a deep breath. Now I know why he always refused for me to examine him. Mr. King looked at Dr. Clark. I knew something was off about him, but I had no idea that he was an android. Now what happens? Dr. Clark pulled out a chair, sat down, and rested his arm on the briefing table. He will not survive this. He looked at Philip, Austin, and Mr. King. Someone in this room most likely poisoned him. Philip looked at Dr. Clark. How do you poison an android? A complete android or even a hybrid android can be contaminated with a complicated computer virus that can shut down their system. Some may take minutes or hours, while others may take weeks or months to accomplish their task. And of course, hybrids can be any level of human, so a toxic substance or poison can kill the human part of them. Dr. Clark rubbed his eyes. Mr. King looked pale. President Paulson was writhing in pain and holding his stomach. Mr. King suddenly became quite pale. Asked me how he was feeling pain. Dr. Clark looked at Mr. King. Then maybe he is a hybrid. Although most hybrids that I know of have human skin, Paulson did not, which means that he is most likely a full android. Otherwise, the needle would have penetrated his skin. Philip pinched Austin's arm. Ouch! Austin looked at Philip and gave him a dirty look. He said most, Philip, and I am not an android, nor a hybrid. Austin looked over at Mr. King. We need to report this to Agent Fields and Agent Plum immediately. Austin looked at Dr. Clark. Tell me now. What are you going to report this as? Dr. Clark looked at the three men. A heart attack. I suggest that you three do the same. Mr. King looked at Austin and Philip. He seemed to be in shock. I need to say this. I suspect that Agent Plum is an android or hybrid android. I have been watching him for a while and he seems to have a lot of the same mannerisms as President Paulson. I don't know that for sure though. Mr. King closed his eyes for a moment. Austin looked at Mr. King. That could make him an extremely dangerous android if he is programmed to react to an attack against the president. Mr. King looked confused. Philip looked at Mr. King. I think what Austin is saying is that anyone who knows that Paulson is an android won't believe our little heart attack story. Mr. King nodded and plopped down in the nearest chair. Austin spoke up. We need to blindside Agent Plum and reprogram him. He looked at Dr. Clark. Do you know how to reprogram androids? Dr. Clark shook his head. That's not in my field of training. Austin smiled. I have an idea. Mr. King, I need a clean phone line. Can I trust you? Mr. King gave Austin a look that said, Are you kidding me? Austin almost laughed and thought, yeah, the guy saw me poison the president and still has not said a word about it. Mr. King pointed to the phone on the briefing table. Line 3 is clean. Austin made a quick phone call to the SMU facility in California. It was a brief conversation, but packed a big punch. Austin turned and looked at Dr. Clark. We need to keep this news from Agent Plum and Agent Fields when they get back. Mr. King looked at Austin. Well, we are in luck there. I heard Agent Fields say that they were gone until midday tomorrow. There was a knock on the door, and then the door slowly opened. It was Dr. Clark. He looked at the partially burnt examining table that was missing a big chunk, and then looked at Dr. Paolo and the others. What happened to President Paulson? Austin answered, He self-destructed. The next morning, Austin woke up early and went to check on Sayers. He knocked on his door. It's Lieutenant Austin Miller, sir. A moment later, Sayers opened the door. Good morning, Lieutenant Miller. Come in. Austin smiled. I hope that you slept well, sir. Sayers looked around the grotesquely decorated room that had belonged to President Paulson. The walls were painted light gray and the carpet was black. The bed was round and shaped, and it was covered with a gold and red circus-looking bedspread. Sayers looked at Austin. I think that I would have slept a little better, sans the artwork, Lieutenant. Austin looked at the paintings on the wall and nodded. Those would definitely give me nightmares. Austin looked at Sayers. By lunchtime, you should not have to wear that mask ever again. We are going to say that Paulson had a heart attack in his office this morning. Mr. King will be there with you to assist you with anything that you need and to call Dr. Clark, who would declare President Paulson officially dead. I am sorry that I cannot give you exact time, sir. We are waiting for 2 agents to return and we need to take care of something. I will come and get you as soon as I can and we will put this plan into action. Dr. Paolo briefly examined Agent Fields first. He appears to be fully human. Before anyone could say anything, the doctor continued, just checking to be safe. Next, he pushed Agent Plum's eyelids up and examined his eyes. He pulled on his hair and looked in Agent Plum's ears. Dr. Paolo opened his black bag, which he had set on the counter, and took out a scanner. He turned on the power and scanned Agent Plum from head to toe. He waited while the scanner did its analysis. Dr. Paolo watched the screen. He looked at Austin, Frank, and Sergeant Cooper. Just as I suspected, Plum is a level 2 hybrid android. Everyone looked horrified. Now what do we do? Frank said. Well, to destroy him would be murder, since he has a mostly human anatomy. Why don't we just reprogram him the way that we did Corporal Faith? Frank asked. Dr. Paolo nodded. A good suggestion, Agent Fisher. Frank looked at Agent Plum, who seemed to be coming to. Agent Plum was awake. Dr. Paolo spoke softly. Agent Plum, how are you doing? Where am I? What happened? Agent Plum tried to sit up but wasn't able to. He tried to lift his arms, but they would not move. He was too out of it still to realize that he had been tied down. He looked at Dr. Paolo. Dr. Paolo, what's going on? Dr. Paolo reached in his bag and took out a small vial and a syringe. Austin took a step forward. He had a flashback to the vial and the drops that he had put into President Paulson's coffee. Dr. Paulo looked at Austin. Relax, Agent Miller. This will not harm Agent Plum. This will help him to relax. Austin nodded, and he and Sergeant Cooper and Frank took a step closer and stood around Agent Plum. Agent Plum looked at them, and then at Dr. Paulo, who was about to inject something into his arm. Agent Plum finally realized that he was tied down and pulled hard on his restraints. Relax, Agent Plum. We are here to help you. We'll see, Dr. Paulo spoke reassuringly. Agent Plum looked at the syringe. What is that? Just a little something to help you relax. It will not harm your system. Agent Plum struggled with the bonds that held him down to the table to no avail. Frank had never seen Agent Plum come unnerved like that before, even when he had to physically fight a man off the president one time. Frank took another step forward. Come on, Mike, Frank said. You know Dr. Paulo. He won't do anything to hurt you. Agent Plum looked at Frank and nodded and relaxed. Dr. Paulo inserted the needle into Agent Plum's arm and administered the drug that would help him to relax. You see, Agent Plum? The doctor smiled. That wasn't so bad. Agent Plum looked at Dr. Paulo. What's this all about? Agent Plum, I don't know how to tell you this, so I will just come right out with it. Dr. Paulo held up the scanner and showed Agent Plum the screen. You see this, Agent Plum? Agent Plum nodded, and he looked at the picture graph of a body that showed it was a hybrid. That's what's called a hybrid android. Agent Plum's speech slowed down as he spoke. It shows which parts are android and what parts are human. Agent Plum's eyes started to close from drowsiness. Dr. Paulo looked at Austin, Frank, and Sergeant Cooper. The Haberson is starting to work. Dr. Paulo waited a moment to speak again. He looked compassionately at Agent Plum. This is a scan of your body, Agent Plum. Even though Agent Plum was in a semi-conscious state, he got a little horror on his face and said as loudly as he could, No, that is not true. I'm human, and nothing else. Tears welled up in Agent Plum's eyes and started rolling down his cheeks. He looked at Frank. Frank, tell him it's not true. Frank looked at Agent Plum. He felt sad for him. I'm sorry, Mike. It's true. Agent Plum looked into Frank's eyes for a moment with sadness and fear. What happens now? He turned his head and looked at Dr. Paulo. Dr. Paulo walked over to the counter and set the scanner down and then stood by Agent Plum's side. He laid his hand on his arm. You live life, just as you have been. Agent Plum seemed to relax quite a bit. He closed his eyes. I thought that you were going to destroy or kill me. Are you a danger to anyone, Agent Plum? Dr. Paulo asked. Agent Plum shook his head. No. Then I see no reason that you can't live a normal life. Dr. Paulo spoke encouragingly to Agent Plum. Agent Plum looked at Dr. Paulo. How can I have a normal life? How can I get married and have children and a family? Frank started to get choked up and discreetly turned and walked over to Agent Fields to check on him. He was still passed out. Frank took a deep breath. Dr. Paulo continued his conversation with Agent Plum. Here. Dr. Paulo went to the counter and picked up the scanner again. He went back to Agent Plum's side and held it up for him to see. You see here, Agent Plum? There are very little android parts in you. You are just less than an eighth of an android. You are the lowest level 2 android that I have seen. Agent Plum closed his eyes. Tears streamed heavily down his face. I don't want to be any android. Please take the android parts out, Doctor. Dr. Paulo looked at Austin and Sergeant Cooper and then back at Agent Plum. I can't. It would be too dangerous, and we would have to replace the parts with something. Agent Plum kept his eyes closed while tears continued down his face until the Haberson sedative helped him to fall asleep. Dr. Paulo turned the scanner off and put it back on the counter. He motioned to Austin and Sergeant Cooper. They walked past Frank, who was still standing by Agent Fields, and Dr. Paulo motioned to Frank to follow. Frank followed them to the table. He was very emotional over what he overheard and seeing Agent Plum in that state of mind. Austin and Sergeant Cooper were shaken as well. Dr. Paulo kept the volume of his voice low as he spoke to Austin, Frank, and Sergeant Cooper. I think the most compassionate thing is for me to erase his memory of this whole event. He will go back to thinking that he is fully human. Interim President Sayers started the press conference. My fellow Americans, It is with a heavy heart that I bring you the news that this morning President Earl Paulson suffered a heart attack during a meeting with his top aide. His personal physician, Dr. Jeremy Clark, and 2 House EMTs were unable to fully revive him. He was taken to the infirmary, where he remained in a semi-comatose state until he had a second heart attack and died. President Earl Paulson was pronounced dead at exactly 11:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Sayers continued, "Due to the lack of stability in this country, I have enacted the DOAP 43 Act of 2028 that states," Sayers looked at the document that he was holding and read from it, "If the President shall become ill or deceased or is otherwise unable to carry out his duties as the President of the United States, and the Vice President is ill or deceased or is otherwise unable to carry out or to temporarily take over the duties of acting or interim presidency, the President who most recently held office, if he is fit and able to assume the duties as interim President, he shall therefore assume full responsibility of all presidential duties immediately and until a special presidential election can be held." Sayers put the document back down on the desk. Interim President Sayers looked at the camera. "I am asking each and every American to do their part in this dark time. I am sending a call out to all of the groups and the citizens that are fighting against one another to stop fighting. This is the United States. We need to all work together to stop the civil war that is ravaging our country and get back to the morals and standards that made our country what it is in the first place." Sayers looked right at the camera. "My first act as interim president is to make void the LOTC, also known as the Law of the Constitution, that President Paulson enacted, and to re-establish the real United States Constitution." Sayers tore up a paper that was supposed to be a copy of the LOTC and looked back at the camera. "I will now recite the preamble to the United States Constitution." Interim President Sayers looked directly at the camera and spoke. "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Mr. King said, "I have Interim President Sayers on the phone." Austin said, "Thank you. I have Agent Fisher with me." Sayers was on the line. "Greetings, Agent Lieutenant Miller and Special Agent Fisher. I hope that you both had a good flight." "Yes, sir, we did," Frank answered. "I'm calling you both because I want to invite you to be on my personal security team." Austin and Frank looked at each other. Frank smiled and nodded. Austin nodded back at Frank and smiled. Austin spoke first. "I would be honored, sir." Frank answered, "Agent Fisher here, sir. I would be honored as well." "Very good. You both came very highly recommended by Dr. Paolo, and Mr. King couldn't stop raving about you, Agent Miller." Austin stifled a laugh and looked at Frank before he answered. "Thank you, sir. Would you like us to fly back today?" Austin followed Jerome and sat down in the chair next to him. "I need you to fly me out to California right away." "Sure thing. To the SMU facility?" "Not quite." Agent Acosta looked at Austin. "Is this for a mission?" "I want to fly out and get Sasha and bring her here for a few days. We are going to be married, and I am taking her to D.C. with me." Agent Acosta rubbed his chin. "Using a government plane for personal use. I like that. Sure thing. Count me in." Sasha looked at Austin and was speechless for a moment. "Austin, you look really handsome in that uniform." Austin smiled. "Thank you, Sasha. Do you need help with anything? Are you ready to go?" "I've got everything." Sasha looked over her shoulder and shouted, "Okay, I'm leaving now." "Who are you talking to?" asked Austin as he tried to peek through the open door to see who Sasha was talking to. Sasha looked at Austin. "My roommate, Brenda." "She still lives here?" Austin asked, still trying to look. "Yeah." Sasha put the suitcase down and yelled over her shoulder again, "Brenda, come on out here so that Austin can see you, please." A red-haired woman in her 30s came to the front door. She was carrying a bowl of chocolate ice cream. "Oh, hi, Austin. How have you been?" "I've been good, and you?" "The same." Hey, you two have a good time in Vegas. Brenda went back to the living room and sat down on the couch and continued watching a movie and eating her ice cream. Sasha picked up her suitcase. Are you happy? She looked at Austin and walked out of the apartment and closed the door behind her. There was a woman already sitting in the aisle seat. It was the blonde-haired woman that he had run into at the checkout counter. Frank did not want to be rude and climb over her, so he looked at her and asked, Would you mind terribly letting me through? Frank asked politely. Frank noticed that the woman had earbuds in and probably did not hear him. He was about to ask her again when the stewardess tapped him on the shoulder and said, Would you mind taking your seat, sir? We are about to take off. Frank nodded and looked at the blonde-haired woman that was seated. Now she had her head in a book in addition to the earbuds. Okay, lady, which do you want, my backside or my front side in your face? The woman looked up at him shocked. I beg your pardon? Frank's mouth dropped open. He pointed to her earbuds. She looked at him and pulled one earbud out. The music stopped. Austin looked at Neil. The plan is for Greg to drop you off at a state facility in Lower Nevada on his way to Arizona. Oh, and you're gonna love this. Neil half smiled. What? Elizabeth has been picked up by our forces and is on her way to the facility in Nevada. Neil almost fell over with shock, happiness, and relief. He made sure to keep his voice down. Buddy, that is the best news that I could have possibly heard. Neil looked around the warehouse. I don't know how to thank you guys. Austin answered, You can thank us by staying alive, helping us to stop this monster, and bringing up that baby of yours. I'll do whatever I can. I think that we are going to name our baby Austin Phillip. You guys are the best. It's a boy? Philip asked. Philip Austin sounds nice too, you know, Philip joked. It's a girl, but I'm sure neither she nor Elizabeth will mind. Neil winked and smiled at Philip, alphabetical order man. You'll have a lot of work to do for KI when you get to Nevada. Try to get some rest on the way if you can, Austin said. Neil looked confused. You mentioned KI a few minutes ago too. Who is KI? Philip and Austin laughed. Austin spoke first. It's the name of our elite group. It's an acronym, KAIA. Kicking ass in America. Austin smiled brightly. Neil chuckled. That's great. Who thought of that? Austin smiled. Who do you think? Austin tapped his finger on his own chest and grinned ear to ear. Greg walked up and looked at Neil. We need to get you in the crate. Here's a bottle of water. You're going to need it. Just as Neil had walked a few feet away, he heard Austin say his name. Hey, Neil. Neil turned around and looked at Austin. Yeah? Austin grinned. Toughen up, Buttercup. Neil shook his head and smiled. Thanks, I needed that. He followed Greg to the back of the truck. Austin had brought back both good and tough memories of being in the SMU Academy. Every time Neil had a hard time with anything or was about to give up, Austin would say, Toughen up, Buttercup. Neil smiled and took a deep breath. He was lucky to have a friend like him. Neil was surprised how much hotter and stuffier it got in the back of the truck once the door was pulled shut. He closed his eyes and tried to take slow, calm breaths. He was not claustrophobic, but he liked to breathe, and thoughts of suffocating in the hot, stale air while riding through the desert started infiltrating his mind. Neil held his breath a few moments and then leaned forward and rested his head against the front of the crate. He positioned his mount near one of the small openings between the slats of the crate and did his best to remain calm and to breathe the air that had filtered into the truck when the door had been opened for inspection and through the open vent. Agent Frank Fisher remained at the president's limousine after Agent Jones was taken away for almost an hour. He leaned forward against the limo with his hands folded and on the roof. His eyes unwillingly showed his sadness as images of his friend being taken away filled his mind. He looked across the empty parking lot and held back tears. He wanted to go into the facility to find out what had happened to his friend, but he knew that he had to stay by the limo until he could fully regain composure. It seemed like an eternity before Frank heard the buzzer of the door behind him. He turned and looked. There was a tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed soldier that was around 26 years old in an SMU field agent uniform standing at the door. "Agent Fisher, come with me." Frank nodded and followed the young man. He had never seen him before. Frank tried to hide his somber mood, but he was barely able to. He was tired of playing their game. The young military agent led Frank to a small office that was located 3 doors down from the entrance of the building. There was a metal desk and 2 metal and navy fabric chairs opposite the desk. The desk was empty except for an avocado green colored phone, a stapler, and a nameplate that read Sergeant Cooper. Frank could not read Sergeant Cooper the way that he could read most people. As much as he wanted to scream "No!" he kept his cool. I'm afraid he was a bit clumsy, sir. Sergeant Cooper nodded his head and seemed to have an expression of satisfaction. Either he believed Frank, or he was pleased that Frank played along with their game. Frank remained blank-faced. Sergeant Cooper leaned back in his chair again. "I'm sending you on a dangerous mission, Agent Fisher. To be honest, I was quite surprised that President Paulson suggested you, since you have no military background outside of the SMU Academy. I am not ashamed to say that I was hoping for someone with military prowess outside of government service. But the President highly recommended you, so either he has utmost confidence in you or he wants you to be killed in the line of duty." Frank was quite shocked at the sergeant's statement and almost dropped his cup of water on the floor. Some of the water splashed out on his arm, and he hastily wiped it up with his handkerchief that was in his front suit coat pocket. Frank looked at Sergeant Cooper. Had the sergeant seen a glimmer of emotion in his eyes when he lied and said that Jones was clumsy? Frank, uncertain of what to say, kept silent for a moment before he spoke. "I'm not sure what to make of that, Sergeant Cooper, but I will do my best to not only finish whatever mission you choose to send me on, but to stay alive." Sergeant Cooper slammed his fist down on his desk and smiled. "Great, that's exactly what I wanted to hear." Sergeant Cooper leaned forward on his desk again. "This is a clean room, Agent Fisher, and anything that you say here stays with me. I am, however, glad that you are careful with your words and that you keep your opinions and your emotions to yourself. That's exactly the kind of man that I want on my team." Sergeant Cooper grinned. "Well, outside of almost dropping your water cup on the floor, we'll work on that." After Corporal Faith took Special Agent Frank Fisher to pick up his uniform, he was brought to his room. Frank showered and changed into his new field agent uniform and rested until Corporal Faith came back and brought him to the briefing room to be briefed with the other men. Frank was glad that the elite group of men were professional and had no qualms about accepting him into the group. The men were to set up a perimeter around a facility in Nevada near the California border that was housing traitors to the president. They were given jumpsuits that matched the terrain. The group of 5 men, including Frank and Corporal Faith, would be dropped off a quarter mile from the facility and had 4 hours to set up base camp and to hike around the facility's outer perimeter to set up sound and surveillance equipment, including high-powered cameras. Frank was more excited than nervous about his first mission. He wondered if there were more to it than what they were briefed on. It did not sound too dangerous if they did not get caught. The men were excused from briefing and told to show up at the tarmac on top of the building at 1900 hours to leave for the mission. Technicians would load the helicopter with the supplies and the equipment. When briefing was over, Frank received some light training from Corporal Faith in the gym and then went back to his quarters and sat down on his bed. He thought about Neil and wondered what happened to Elizabeth. He had never broken a promise to anyone, especially to a close friend like Neil. It hurt him deeply that he could not keep his promise to contact someone to help Elizabeth to escape. Frank rested his head in his hands for a few minutes before he heard a knock on his door. He stood up. The door was unlocked, so he just shouted, "Come in!" The door slowly opened. It was Lieutenant Austin Miller. Frank was not the saluting kind, and even though it had been recently confirmed that saluting was no longer necessary, this man's persona was so strong that Frank found himself saluting him. "At ease, soldier," Austin smiled. Frank laughed at himself and relaxed. "Anyone else in here with you?" Austin asked. Frank looked around the room, which was obviously empty, and held his hands up in a gesture. "There doesn't appear to be." Austin looked at Frank and smiled and shook his head. "Amateurs." Austin went over to the bathroom door, which was closed. He opened it and looked inside. He walked over to the shower and made sure that it was empty. Frank followed Austin, but stopped at the bathroom door and watched with amusement. He saw that Austin had a rectangular scanner with him and was pointing it at the ceiling, the vents, the walls, under the bathroom sink, in the bathroom medicine cabinet, and on the floor. Austin noticed that Frank was watching him. He held the scanner up to Frank and scanned him. "This baby can pick up bugs from 50 feet away, but quite take any chances," he grinned. Frank's look of amusement disappeared quickly. "Is this part of the initiation process to be a field agent?" Austin took out a small 2-inch long by 1-inch wide black object. Frank looked at it. "What is that, a recorder? Is our conversation being recorded?" Frank pointed to the object. Austin held up the object, which had a simple plastic outer casing. He slid a switch to the right. "This, my man, is not a recorder. This is a state-of-the-art scrambler. I will explain in a few minutes." Frank looked at it and then at Austin. "I don't hear anything." "That's a good thing." Austin smiled and set the scrambler on the floor in the center of the room. Frank looked at the scrambler for a few minutes before he turned his attention back to Austin. Austin gave Frank a sidelong glance as he scanned the rest of Frank's quarters from the ceiling to the floor and every piece of furniture. Once he had finished, he looked at Frank directly. "Welcome to the team. I see that your uniform has a special ops insignia. Congratulations. How did you get such a prestigious promotion when you just joined us today?" Frank was hesitant to answer. "You ask a lot of questions, Lieutenant." Frank looked at Austin's name badge again and continued. "Miller. You're as smart as Neil said you are." Frank's countenance dropped. He walked over to the bed and sat down. "What do you know about me?" "Okay, Frank, this room is clean and so are you. So I'm gonna tell you. Neil and I went to the SMU Academy together. I trust his judgment. He said that you were going to make a call to help his wife Elizabeth to escape." Frank stood up and was about to say something when Austin held up his hand. "Before you say anything, I'm letting you know that this is not a trap. Think back, Frank, to your conversations with Neil. I know that you two were quite close. Think about what he said about his friend who was the best barbecue chef in the state. What was his friend's name?" Frank thought for a moment and then got a look of recognition on his face. His jaw dropped and he looked at Austin and smiled. "Austin Miller." "That's right, Austin Miller, the best barbecue expert in the state of California." Austin smiled. "You were even at my house one time." Frank looked at Austin. He started to remember. "You don't have to say anything, Frank. I can tell that you are wondering if this is a setup or a trap to try to get you to tell us what Neil told you." Frank became annoyed. "Neil is dead. He was pushed into an incinerator and you know it." Frank, you lost your cool," Austin said as he circled around Frank and sized him up. Once he was back in front of Frank, he said, "You know the story, Frank. Neil was very clumsy. He was throwing something into the incinerator and fell in." Frank's face was so hot that he felt as though he had been dipped in hot boiling water. He was angry and he was frustrated. He was tired of this game. He turned his back on Austin and walked over to the dresser that was on the opposite wall from the door, turned around and leaned against it. He folded his arms. "Now what? Off the team because I spoke the truth?" Frank unfolded his arms and put his hands in his pant pockets. "One thing to have to play this game out there in the world. But if you guys expect me to be dishonest with my own team, then I'm the wrong man for this job, no matter who recommended me." Austin smiled and walked towards Frank and stopped a foot away from him. And then his smile turned to a grin. "I don't care who recommended you for the unit. I like your spunk." Austin turned around and walked over to a small table and pulled out a chair and sat backwards in it. "I know who recommended you to this unit, Frank. President Paulson. I know that anyone that he recommends either must have almost superhuman strength, or he wants them dead. My guess, after talking to Neil, is that Paulson wants you dead. Frank looked at Austin. Austin gave Frank a serious look. I need to tell you something particularly important. Keep this information to yourself no matter what. Do not even repeat it to me at any time after I leave this room. Do you understand? Frank nodded. He walked over to the table and pulled out a chair and put it 2 feet from Austin and sat in it the right way. What did I say about President Paulson never recommending anyone unless he wants them dead or they have superhuman strength? Just what you said now. Why? You are the second person that Paulson recommended for the team, specifically the Special Operations Unit that you were placed in. Can you guess who the other man is? Austin looked closely at Frank. Frank looked shocked for a moment, and then he looked at the floor before looking back at Austin and saying, Sergeant Cooper? Guess again. Austin's smile faded as he waited for Frank's response. Who is a little too squeaky clean in the unit? In my unit, I only met 3 of the men shortly in briefing, but there didn't seem to be anything out of place about them. Suddenly, Frank realized who Austin was talking about. Corporal Faith? Austin slowly nodded his head. You got it. Frank looked at Austin. What does this mean exactly? That he is a spy or a mole? Worse. What do you mean? Think back to your last 2 conversations with Neil about the coordinates and the governors of 4 states. Frank got a little nervous because he realized that no one could be trusted, and even if Austin had been a close friend to Neil, it did not mean that he would not stab him in the back. Not in this time and place. Frank bit his lip and remained silent. Austin noticed the expression on Frank's face and said, Relax. You do not have to say anything. I can see what you are thinking. Can I really be trusted? Don't talk. Just listen, Frank. Frank kept his gaze at the army green-colored carpet. I'm listening. Our wonderful Corporal Faith is an android. Frank looked up so quickly at Austin that he almost gave himself a whiplash. The sad thing is the kid probably doesn't even know it. They are programmed that way, some of them, so that if they are ever captured, they only have recollection of their role, not what they really are. Frank looked at Austin and spoke slowly as he processed the information. Why would he place an android in our unit? Well, knowing Paulson, to spy. Because Paulson trusts no one, not even his own team. How do you know Corporal Faith is an android? Gaz and I figured it out the first week. They gave him a little too much superhuman strength. If Corporal Faith has no knowledge that he is an android, how can he get information back to the president? Through his memory banks, he can be accessed at any time without his knowledge. His conversations and observations can be downloaded completely, or they can search for keywords and download any details that have to do with it, what they are looking for, such as anything to do with President Paulson. Frank nodded. He looked over at the scrambler. Now will you tell me what the scrambler is for, since there obviously weren't any wires around? Austin smiled. Of course, it emits a high-frequency signal that only androids can hear. They cannot quite detect what it is, or even the location where it is coming from. It shuts down their ability to hear anything around them except for the high-pitched sound. Just in case Corporal Faith is anywhere near here, androids can hear a whisper up to 50 feet away. Frank looked pleased. I'd like to use that on President Paulson, he laughed. Austin looked at Frank. We already have. Frank looked at Austin closely as though a bomb was about to drop. And? President Paulson is a fully functioning android. Frank stood up and walked into circle while talking. You're kidding me. I mean, I had my suspicions, but to actually hear about this information as a verified fact is unnerving. Frank stopped walking and looked at Austin. Who tested him with the scrambler? Sergeant Cooper. He's a brave man. Austin nodded. He sure is. And Paulson didn't figure it out? Not so far that we know of. Who else knows about this? The whole Special Ops team minus Corporal Faith, of course. Frank rubbed his temples and ran his hands through his hair. This is huge. Of course, the team never talks about it. We managed to have 3 secret meetings without Corporal Faith a week after he arrived. We passed him off as special training, and we sent the good old Corporal on a wild goose chase. My idea to give him the wrong map. No one was the wiser about it, including Faith, but we don't take any chances. Frank sat down in the chair again. What can be done? Austin smiled. A lot is being done. A few of us formed a special group called Kea. Kea? Frank asked. Never heard of them. Austin smiled. You will. KS stands for Kicking Ass in America, Austin said proudly. Frank chuckled. I like it. Well, you're going to like what I have to tell you next even better. You'd better stay seated. Frank looked at Austin. Austin took a deep breath and looked into Frank's eyes. You were wrong about Neil being pushed into the incinerator. Frank looked sad. Please don't tell me it was suicide. No. Frank, take a deep breath. Me and a few guys helped Neil to escape. Frank stood up and immediately sat down again. What? Me and a friend came to get Neil earlier, remember? You were standing next to Neil by Paulson's limo. I can't believe it. I'm speechless. I'm so happy. Frank stood up and then sat down again. He looked confused. I looked right at you. How could I not recall that you were one of the men that came to get Neil when you came here? Or not remember that I had met you before and had even been to your house? I'm usually great with faces. Frank rubbed his forehead. My guess, Frank, is from the trauma that you suffered in learning of your friend's so-called violent end. Frank rubbed his upper lip. I guess that could happen. Frank looked at Austin again, trying to remember. I'm drawing a blank. You only looked at us for a moment and then turned back towards the limo. My guess is to hide your emotions. How were you able to help him escape? A friend of mine who was in our unit, Jerome Sanchez, used to be a special effects guy for the movies. He specialized in horror movies. He made up a dummy that looked like Neil. Frank's look of shock turned to a smile and then to a frown. What about his wife, Elizabeth? I had promised Neil that I would contact someone to help her escape. That was done before Neil even left. There are good guys and ears all around this facility, Special Agent Frank Fisher. Frank nodded in relief. Where was he taken? He was driven to a safe facility in Nevada, close to the Nevada-California border. Frank got a sick look on his face. That's where our special ops assignment is, at a facility in Nevada near the Nevada-California border. I know for a fact no one leaked this, or several of us would already be dead. Austin took a breath. What are the odds, though, that it's the same facility that Neil is in? I'd say fairly good. I will get word out to them to warn them, and to let them know that outside of Corporal Faith, the rest of the troop are friendlies. Austin rubbed his left wrist. What time are you guys leaving? We're leaving tonight at 1900 and return in several days. Is your mission to attack? Austin asked gingerly, knowing that special ops agents never divulged their missions, but since Frank already did, he pushed a little harder. They were basically on the same team. Austin thought that Frank would be a good candidate for KO. We are to set up a surveillance perimeter, video and audio. Austin smiled. That's good. That means that they suspect that something is going on at the facility, but they are not certain. Otherwise, it would be an infiltration. That gives us a little more time. Austin smiled, and it actually gives us some surprisingly good leverage. He looked at his watch. I've got to set some things up. Austin stood up. Remember this, Corporal Faith is a highly trained and dangerous android. You may believe that he is one of us, but he can be accessed from anywhere at any time and put on kill mode. That means his team and anyone else around. I will remember that. Frank spoke as he absentmindedly nodded. I'm surprised you guys haven't set up a friendly little accident for Corporal Faith. Austin smiled. Nah, we like the guy. And once this is all over, we can reprogram him any way we would like, including his kill mode. Frank chuckled. If anyone asked Frank, we had a friendly little conversation about sports while I was here welcoming you. Got it. Austin picked up the scrambler and headed toward the door. He turned and looked at Frank, who had walked up behind him, and said, Stay safe out there tonight, Frank, and over the next several days. Frank nodded. Thank you. Austin smiled one last time at Frank. Do you have any questions before I shut this thing off? Austin held up the scrambler. Austin turned off the scrambler and put it back in his pocket and left Frank's room. Frank sat on his bed and cried. He was so grateful that Neil and Elizabeth were safe. Frank washed his face and prepared himself mentally for the mission as he replayed his and Austin's conversation several times in his head. Frank, Taylor, and Smith all laid down and fell asleep within minutes. Around 1:45 a.m., Frank was feeling a little restless. He rolled over on his stomach and tried to fall back to sleep, but could not. He glanced over at Corporal Faith, who was still monitoring the surveillance feed. Frank sat up. He was about 2 feet forward from Corporal Faith and facing toward the facility. He picked up the second set of headphones and decided to listen in. It sounded like a friendly poker game was going on. Frank smiled as he listened to the friendly banter. None of the voices were Neil's. Around 2 a.m., Frank got sleepy again and lifted his arms to stretch as he yawned. He heard Corporal's face moving around, but everything else seemed eerily quiet. All of a sudden, Frank felt an arm around his chest under his uplifted arm and felt a cloth being held over his mouth that smelled like ether. That was the last thing that Frank remembered before everything went dark. Special Agent Frank Fisher started to come to within 10 minutes after the chloroform had been used to knock him out. He never imagined that his unit would have been blindsided. Before he opened his eyes, he thought back to being grabbed. He remembered looking at Corporal Faith and listening to the surveillance feed, and everything seemed fine. Frank remembered hearing Corporal Faith move around just before he was grabbed. In a sense of panic, wondering if it could have been part of Paulson's plan to have him terminated in the desert, Frank opened his eyes and attempted to sit up quickly. Frank felt a searing pain in his wrists and shoulders and cried out in pain. The room was dark. Frank felt disoriented. Could Corporal Faith have done this to him? Frank almost panicked as he realized that his hands and feet were tied to something. Frank took a few slow breaths and calmed his mind. His eyes were starting to adjust. There was a small light on across the room. Frank suddenly realized that someone was walking towards him. He struggled to try to free himself from his bonds. Neil looked at Frank. "I want you to meet Austin's brother." Frank nodded without really registering what Neil had said. The men waited for Claire to return. Frank looked at her. Claire had such a beautiful, soft, and easygoing way about her. Frank took his eyes off Claire long enough to look at Neil. Frank suddenly realized what Neil had said. "What do you mean, Austin's brother?" While Claire was tending to several rope abrasions on Frank's wrist, Neil explained, "Austin has a brother named Milton. Phil for short, that's his contact here." Frank smiled. "That's terrific. We have a lot to talk about later, Neil." Neil smiled. "Yes, we do." He looked at Claire. "By the way, let me formally introduce you to Claire Sandy. She can absolutely be trusted. She is fully human, she is single, and 27 years old. Never married, no kids, and she was in the military. When we had one." Both Claire and Frank blushed. Frank held out his hand for Claire to shake. "Hi, I'm Frank Fisher, good friend, if not best friend, to Neil Jones, who apparently likes to embarrass people." Frank gave Neil a faint look of embarrassment while rolling his eyes. Around 10 a.m., there was a knock on the door of Lieutenant Austin Miller's quarters. He opened the door to find Agent Fields standing there with Sergeant Philip Adams. Austin kept his emotions in check. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked. "Come with us, sir." Agent Fields looked at Austin with zero emotion. Austin nodded and walked out into the hall and closed the door behind him. The moment Fields had his back to them, he glanced at Philip. Philip kept his cool but gave Austin a quick warning glance. The two men were brought to a briefing room on the second lower level. "Have a seat, gentlemen. Agent Plum will be with you both in a few minutes." Agent Fields led the two men into the small room and then closed the door and waited outside. Austin and Philip looked at each other but dared to say nothing. It was doubtful that this was a clean room, and the men expected that someone was sitting in the next room behind the two-way mirror. It was unusual to be brought to this lower-level briefing room. Had they found out about Agent Neil Jones' rescue, or the warning to the Nevada facility, or perhaps they were being held for questioning, or both? Austin and Philip refrained from looking at the two-way mirror and from showing any emotion whatsoever. A few minutes later, Fields opened the door for Agent Plum. Both Austin and Philip stood up. "At ease, gentlemen, have a seat." Plum pointed to the dark green cushion fabric and metal chairs that were around the rectangular dark hardwood table. Austin and Philip chose the nearest seats next to each other and sat down. Agent Plum had two medium-sized metal folders with him. He sat down at the head of the table next to the men and put their files down on the table. He looked at Austin and Philip as though to examine them. Agent Plum took a quick breath and finally said, "President Paulson has two SMU positions open that he needs to fill in a hurry." He requested 2 SMU field agents to temporarily fill the positions until he can replace the positions permanently after the next SMU Academy takes place in the spring. Unless you two work out, and we both decide to stay. Austin and Philip looked at each other and then at Agent Blum. They both loved their current positions but knew that they had to play the game and had no choice but to say yes. I think that I can speak for the both of us, sir, when I say that we would be honored. Austin glanced at Philip, who seemed to agree with what he had said. Austin paused for just a moment before he asked Agent Blum, "What made you decide to choose us?" Austin was inwardly wondering if there were suspicions over both him and Philip, and if the president just wanted to keep a closer eye on them and to prevent them from further action. They certainly would lose most of the freedom that they now had. Agent Blum looked at Austin and Philip and smiled. He picked up the files and set them back down. They both had exemplary records. Austin gave his most genuine fake smile and held his hand out to shake Agent Blum's hand. "I would be honored, sir." The men patiently watched the hallway through the window. About 5 minutes later, they saw Mr. King lead Agent Blum and Agent Fields into the main briefing room, and as he was instructed, he closed the door and went back to his quarters. Austin took a breath. "Let's roll, Philip." Philip nodded and followed Austin out of the room and across the hall. Frank closed the door quickly behind them. Once Philip and Austin were in the briefing room and they closed the door, Frank and Sergeant Cooper went into the hallway and stood next to the briefing room door. Agent Blum looked at Austin and said, "What's going on? Why are we meeting in here?" Austin casually slipped his hand into his pocket and looked at Agent Blum and Agent Fields. "I recommend that you both have a seat." Agent Blum and Agent Fields listened to Austin since he was a superior and sat down in 2 of the chairs that were around the table. Austin waited until they were completely seated and pressed the button on the small device that he had in his pocket. Immediately, Agent Blum and Agent Fields shook violently and then they passed out. Austin shouted, "Sergeant Cooper!" The door opened and Sergeant Cooper came in and closed the door behind him. Frank kept watch in the hallway. "Sergeant Cooper and Agent Adams, please take these 2 to the infirmary as we discussed. Frank and I will disarm the room and retrieve Dr. Powell and meet you there in 7 minutes." Sergeant Cooper and Philip nodded. Philip went and stood next to Agent Fields. He looked at Austin. "The seats aren't hot anymore, right?" Austin looked at Philip. He never used to be this way. He was nervous and asked questions the night before that were out of his character. He felt compassion for his friend who must have been traumatized by the incident with President Paulson. "No, Philip, the seats are not hot." Sergeant Cooper went over to the closet while Austin and Philip were talking and got the double gurney out that they had placed there the day before. Took the large white sheet that they had laid on the gurney and placed it on the table, then pushed the gurney over to Agent Fields' chair. Then he and Philip and Austin carefully picked Agent Fields up and placed him on the lower gurney. Then they put Agent Blum, who was taller, on the top gurney at 6'3", his feet hung over the edge. "I thought that he would be heavier than this," Philip said. Sergeant Cooper looked at Philip. "They are making them lighter these days." Frank went into the briefing room and closed the door and locked it behind him. He smiled at Austin, who was under the table removing the wires that he and Philip had placed there the day before. Frank sat on the floor near Austin. He started pulling wires down from underneath the table and the chairs. "It's amazing what a few wires and some chewing gum will do." "Very funny, Agent Fisher. Chew on this?" Austin held up a gray putty type substance. "And you just might use a few fillings." Frank laughed. Frank opened the door. He looked at Austin. Austin looked tired. "I'm ready," he said. The men went to Mr. King's room and knocked. It took almost a minute for Mr. King to answer. He looked as though he had been awake all night. Austin and Frank entered Mr. King's room and shut the door. Austin looked at Mr. King. "Man, you look like hell. Didn't you get any sleep?" Mr. King shook his head. "Not much. I had nightmares all night that President Paulson came back to life and came here and killed me." "There's no chance of that now." Frank lifted his hands in the air. "He exploded." Mr. King stood there with his mouth open. His glasses slid halfway down his nose. "Exploded?" His voice cracked as he spoke. Austin looked around the room. "We need to get some coffee in there and wake you up a little bit." Mr. King looked at Austin. "Coffee?" His voice cracked again. He seemed to be in a daze and suddenly snapped out of it. "Oh no, I will never drink coffee again." He pushed his glasses back up to the bridge of his nose. Austin grinned at Mr. King. "Relax, no one is going to poison your coffee." Why don't you splash some water on your face and comb your hair and get dressed while you are at it? Agent Plum and Agent Fields should be here at any time. Mr. King went over to his organizer and looked at his phone that was sitting on top of it. Let's see. There's a message from Agent Plum. He said that he and Fields are on their way back and should be here in 30 minutes. They are early, Frank rubbed his chin. What time did he send that message? Mr. King looked at the message. 20 minutes ago. Austin gave Mr. King a look. Don't you read your messages when they come in? Mr. King looked nervously at Austin. Normally I do if I hear them. I was in the bathroom. I just got out when you guys knocked on the door. Austin involuntarily sniffed and then crinkled his nose. He looked at Mr. King. Hurry and get dressed. We do not have time for a shower. I will go get Philip. Make sure, Mr. King, that you are in the hallway when Agent Plum and Agent Fields will come in and intercept them like we discussed. We do not want him to roam the halls looking for Carlson. And I added to the plan in the middle of the night. I will come back to get you when it's time. Sayers has a mask to make him look like Carlson. He's going to fake having a heart attack in his office. You are to call Dr. Clark and will then declare him dead. I already called Dr. Clark this morning and told him about the plan. Oh, added Frank, and don't freak out when you see Sayers. He is wearing a really good mask and looks just like Carlson. Mr. King stood there in shock and just stared at Frank. Don't worry, you will be able to tell it's not Carlson. Just look at the wig, the mouth, and the eyes. Sayers has blue eyes. That is why he has to wear sunglasses around other people. We didn't get him contacts. Yeah, Mr. King, please, Austin said. Yes, sir. Mr. King rushed over to his closet and grabbed a suit and went to the bathroom to get dressed and combed his hair. Austin looked at Frank. Here we go, Frank. This is a done deal. Frank nodded. A piece of cake. As promised, Agent Fields and Agent Plum were waiting for him and Philip. There was a quick briefing before the men boarded the presidential plane. Austin and Philip sat together but refrained from talking. Once they reached Washington, D.C., they would stay in separate suites at the Black House. During the flight, Austin thought about his exchange with Dr. Powell. The doctor must have had a change of heart. Austin had no idea how he was going to accomplish the task. He did not sense that it was a trap, although he wondered if it could be. He could put the drops in the president's coffee and get caught and be executed. Austin shook his head. He knew that he was thinking too much. Austin practiced in his mind how he would put the drops into President Carlson's coffee. It was a practice that he often did before every mission. He believed that it contributed to his success. Occasionally, when Austin was doing this visualization exercise, a thought could go bad, and this time was no exception. Austin again pictured putting the drops into the president's coffee. He saw himself handing President Carlson's coffee to him and then having the president turn around and insist that Austin drink it himself and hand it back to him. Austin opened his eyes. He took a breath. He was the answer man, so it did not take long for him to think of a solution. He would simply have a clumsy moment and bump the president's hand as he took the cup back and spill the entire cup of coffee on the floor. Austin was grateful for the one-way windows in the president's airplane. He looked out the window and lost himself deep in thoughts. He missed his brother and wished that he could see him. He wondered how Frank was doing on the mission. Austin hated long flights. He closed his eyes and thought about the woman that he had dated years ago. He loved Sasha, and she loved him back. Dated for 2 years before she finally broke up with him when he would not commit to marriage. Austin smiled. He decided when this mess was all over that he would call her or stop by her apartment. The flight to Washington, D.C. was uneventful. Austin and Philip deslaned along with President Carlson, Agent Mike Plum, Agent Rick Fields, and a couple of personal flight attendants. Pilot and co-pilot remained on the plane for a while. Austin wanted to get the drops into President Carlson's coffee as soon as he could. He never understood how androids were able to eat and drink like humans were, but then again, he never studied about them or their working anatomy. Austin and Philip were to accompany the president to his office for a special meeting with him, while Agents Plum and Fields were sent to take care of something outside of the Black House. Mr. King looked at the president. He almost felt sorry for him. I didn't put anything in your coffee, sir. No one did. With his back to the president, Mr. King walked over to the phone that was on the briefing table and glanced at Austin along the way. He winked at Austin and then picked up the phone. Even though his hands were shaking, his voice remained relatively calm. "We need an emergency team here, Stat, and Dr. Clark. President Paulson has taken ill." Austin breathed a sigh of relief. The medical emergency team, which consisted of a doctor and 2 EMTs, was there within a few minutes. They put President Paulson on a gurney and administered oxygen to him. His eyes were very dark and glassy. He seemed to be staring at the ceiling, and his mumbling was incoherent. Dr. Jeremy Clark was 57 years old, 5 foot 9 inches tall, and had golden blonde hair and blue eyes. He looked at Mr. King and asked, "What was he doing when he collapsed?" Mr. King looked at the doctor. He was yelling. Then he grabbed his chest. Maybe he had a heart attack. Mr. King spoke blandly and then turned his back to Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark looked a little annoyed. "We will determine what happened to the president, Mr. King." The first EMT, Fossil Kane, age 25, just under 6 feet tall, with dark brown hair and dark brown eyes, looked at Dr. Clark. Kane was holding the tubing of a drip IV and looking very confused. "Sir, the needle will not penetrate the president's skin." Dr. Clark walked over to Kane. "You must be doing something wrong." Dr. Clark took the needle and cannula from Kane and attempted to insert it himself. He looked at the needle and then at Kane. "Try another needle, Kane," he ordered and stood up. "Yes, sir." Kane inserted a new needle into the cannula and tried again. It would not penetrate the president's skin. Kane looked at Dr. Clark. "Sir, the needle bent." He held up the needle to show him. Dr. Clark looked at the needle and then to the president. He felt for a pulse. It was weak. He looked at the second EMT, Sam Hebert, age 43, 5 foot 10 inches, who had medium brown hair and brown eyes. Hebert had just finished taking President Paulson's blood pressure for the second time. "Check his pupils." Hebert nodded and took out a small flashlight and attempted to get a pupil reaction from the president's eyes. "There's no reaction, sir." He took out a stethoscope and listened to the president's heart. Hebert looked at Kane and gave him a strange look, and then he looked at Dr. Clark. Hebert lowered the volume of his voice. "I think that he is a hybrid, sir." Clark looked sternly at Hebert and then at King. "Get him to the infirmary and stabilize him the best that you can. I will be in shortly." Mr. King looked at Austin. "Well, we are in luck there. I heard Agent Fields say that they will be gone until midday tomorrow." Austin smiled. "Perfect. That gives us ample time to put my plan into effect." Philip smiled at Austin. "Your plan?" Austin flashed Philip a quick smile and leaned into the group, who were all seated at the table. "Here's what we'll do." Austin briefly told him of his plan. Everyone nodded their heads as Austin spoke. Austin finished by saying, "Is everyone with me?" Everyone agreed, including Dr. Clark. "I will go check on Paulson and inform Hebert and Kane to not say anything about this. They are typically pretty good about that and will not say anything anyway, but just to be safe. This is quite a big deal." Dr. Clark left the president's office and went directly to the infirmary. Austin looked at Mr. King. "Mr. King, we need your help to make this plan work." Mr. King pricked up. "Me, sir?" "Yes, you have a very important role. When Agents Plum and Fields return tomorrow, I want you to tell them that the president wants to see them right away in the main briefing room down the hall. You are to lead them in there and tell them that the president will be with them in a few minutes. You are to close the door and go back to your living quarters. We will take care of the rest." Mr. King looked at Austin. "What if they don't want to go?" Austin looked into Mr. King's eyes. "They won't refuse. Not if they believe that you are telling them the truth. Understand?" Mr. King nodded. "I can do that." Mr. King adjusted his glasses and stood up. "If you need anything else, I will be in my quarters, so please do not hesitate to let me know." Austin stood up. "We will." Mr. King left and went to his quarters and did his best to relax and to go to sleep. Austin picked up the phone again and, using line 3, contacted the man that would help to lead the United States through this crisis. When Austin got off the phone, Philip looked at him and said, "We'd better get ready for our guest." Austin nodded and then went down the hall to the main briefing room after making a brief stop in the supply cabinet. About a half an hour before landing, Sergeant Cooper explained a few more details to Dr. Powell. When the men arrived at the Black House, they met Agent Austin Miller and Agent Philip Adams, just inside the second airplane hangar. Austin and Philip escorted Dr. Powell, Frank, Jerome LaCosta, and Sergeant Cooper to the GUV, and Philip drove them to the back entrance of the Black House. For once, Austin was glad that President Paulson did not have any military around, but only a few SMU agents that never asked anyone any questions. Austin inwardly laughed. President Paulson's decision to expunge the military were contributing to his demise. The group passed by 2 SMU agents at the back entrance without any problems. They immediately took Dr. Paulo to see President Paulson, who was in the infirmary. The infirmary was a large, sterile-looking room with 3 hospital beds, some medical equipment, a sink and countertop, and a table with a few chairs around it. The walls were painted off-white and there was an off-white tile floor. Dr. Clark was the only person in the infirmary. With President Paulson, Dr. Paulo looked at Dr. Clark. "Have there been any changes? Has he become alert at all?" Dr. Paulo asked. Dr. Clark looked at Dr. Paulo, whom he recognized from a couple previous visits, and shook his head. "His pulse is still about the same." Dr. Paulo opened his bag and took a small instrument out. "The pulse is not real. It is the programming. If the unit malfunctions or becomes damaged in any way, the brain sector that controls the pulse and heart rate adjusts accordingly. The heart is a machine, there is no blood, and the heartbeat is mechanical." Dr. Paulo held up the small instrument next to President Paulson's head while everyone in the room watched silently. Dr. Paulo looked at Dr. Clark. "Why don't you take a break and come back in 2 hours? I will take over from here." Dr. Clark nodded. He wanted to stay and watch, but looking at the group of agents, he realized that they did not trust him completely. "Thank you, Dr. Paulo, I will." Dr. Clark went to his quarters and picked up a book. It was going to be a long night. Dr. Paulo watched the screen until it stopped loading. He took his finger and pointed it at the lower right portion of the screen. "And this, gentlemen, is the fingerprint of President Paulson's creator." Sergeant Cooper leaned in. "I assumed that President Paulson was an android that went rogue and ran for president on his own to take over the United States, kill off the American people, and replace them with androids." Dr. Paulo looked at Sergeant Cooper. "Yes, Sergeant Cooper, that's exactly it." He looked at the rest of the men. "That is why I decided that something must be done. I had accidentally stumbled upon information that was hidden in the 4 coordinates that had arrived to replace the governors of California, Washington, Oregon, and Utah." "What do you mean?" asked Philip. "And can you please explain the part about killing everyone and replacing them with androids?" "Yeah, I'd like to know more about that too," Frank said. "What good is a country full of androids?" Dr. Paulo looked at Frank. "Because they can take over the world." Agent Jerome Santos finally spoke up. "Yeah, I never understood that whole dictatorship, take over the world mentality. What for, I mean? It does not seem like much fun to have people follow or worship you out of force. And what good is too much money?" Dr. Paulo looked at Agent Santos. "That is a good point, Agent Santos. It never made any sense to me either." Austin looked at Dr. Paulo. "I have several questions, but I want to hear about the plot that you uncovered about Paulson replacing everyone with androids." Dr. Paulo turned his chair around to face the men. "When I first started working for President Paulson, he tempted me by saying that the coordinates, or rather the replacement governors, would help our country. The governors of each state had become hard to control, and I agreed with him. We started by releasing a few androids into the population to perform as regular citizens. Once we saw that they did well, we replaced the governors of Oklahoma, and when that went well, we replaced the governor of New York. It was quite a success. The people thought that Governor Wilson had a change of heart after a serious but brief feigned illness, and was putting the people first. It was all a guise to get everyone to feel relaxed. And later, President Paulson would give the orders for the replacement governors to carry out any one of his evil plans," Austin said as he shook his head. Frank looked at Dr. Paulo. "What happened to the real governor of New York?" Dr. Paulo looked down. "I am ashamed and afraid to say that President Paulson had a murder." Gasps could be heard throughout the room. Frank looked over at Sergeant Cooper. "We reprogrammed Corporal Faith, by the way." Sergeant Cooper nodded. "I figured that when the Nevada facility came back clean." Philip waited for Dr. Paulo's attention. "We witnessed a horrible scene with President Paulson." He looked at his aide, Mr. King, and said, "How is it that I am feeling pain?" and was holding his stomach. "I've got to tell you that it was pretty unnerving." Austin shook his head. "That got to me too." Dr. Paulo nodded. "I imagine that it would. Rest assured, gentlemen, that President Earl Paulson did not really feel emotional or physical pain the way that you or I would. He was programmed with automatic responses." Philip shook his head. "I don't know, Dr. Paulo. He looked to be in pretty severe physical pain and in deep distress and emotional fear to me." Dr. Paulo looked down at the ground for a moment and then turned his chair back around to the computer. He pushed the emotions aside that arose in him with Philip's words. "I assure you, gentlemen, that any symptoms of emotional pain or thoughts and any symptoms of physical pain were purely programmed." Austin stood up and helped Philip up. One of the questions that I had wanted to ask was if there was some sort of listening device on Paulson. Sergeant Cooper, who had just pulled himself off the floor, looked cross. That's something that you could have interrupted Dr. Powell with, Agent Lieutenant Miller, sir. Austin briefly looked at Sergeant Cooper and shrugged. Austin spoke softly. So, was there a listening device on Paulson's body that transmitted back to whoever sent him here? Dr. Powell answered logically. Probably. Sergeant Cooper looked at Dr. Powell. Probably? His tone of voice was tense. Austin stepped next to Sergeant Cooper. Soldier, you're out of line. Stand down. Sergeant Cooper looked at Austin and nodded and took a step back and remained quiet. Austin looked at Dr. Powell. So they could have been listening to our conversation this whole time? I mean, until the explosion. Dr. Powell looked at Austin and smiled. He pulled out a little box from his lab coat and pocket and held it up. This is a special scrambler that prevents that from happening. All the men in the room laughed except Sergeant Cooper, who looked at Austin. Austin nodded at Sergeant Cooper. Sergeant Cooper walked up to Dr. Powell. I want to apologize for my behavior, Doctor. It's completely out of my character and was very rude. Don't worry, Sergeant Cooper. Even the best of us become unraveled sometimes. Sergeant Cooper nodded. Frank stepped in. Dr. Powell, if whoever made Paulson wasn't listening in, why did he explode? I mean, if they were not able to determine if Paulson had been discovered to be an android, how would they know to destroy him? I'm sure that is something that they wouldn't do unless they were beyond sure that he needed to be destroyed. Or was that a side effect from the drops? Austin added. Those are very good questions, gentlemen. You are right, Special Agent Fisher. Someone went through a lot of cost and time and danger to put Paulson in office. They would not take lightly the decision to detonate him. And Agent Lieutenant Miller, the drops do not have that side effect. He turned and looked at Austin. Although that was a good idea. No, I am confident that the self-destruct mode was built into Paulson in case he ever became beyond self-repair, he would self-detonate. Does that answer your questions? Dr. Powell looked at Frank and Austin. They both nodded and said, yes, Doctor. Dr. Powell turned back to the computer. Before he continued talking about the fingerprint, he looked at his chair. This swivel chair has come in quite handy. Dr. Powell once again pointed to the symbol on the screen. The first letter is the country code. Frank looked closely at it. It looks like an A. So the country that the person who created this monster is from a country that starts with an A? And that is correct, Philip. Philip shrugged his shoulders. I don't know. Albuquerque? Austin hit Philip with his elbow. That's not a country, that's a city. Philip looked at Austin. I was joking. I needed to let off a little sting. Philip straightened his collar. There are a lot of countries whose spelling starts with the letter A. How do we know which one? You see the little number right here to the bottom right of the A? Dr. Powell pointed it out. The number 2, Philip answered. Dr. Powell continued. When the New World Order formed, they assigned each country a number. It is not in alphabetical order, and there is no rhyme or reason to it, so don't try to figure out their logic. Dr. Powell took out a small electronic tablet. He entered some information and within 10 seconds got a response. The number 2, according to the New World Order website, belongs to a little-known country just northeast of Russia. It is called Afghanistan. Austin was the only one in the room besides Dr. Powell that had ever heard of it. What else can you tell us, Dr. Powell? Every android maker has a symbol. First we have the country letter, then we have the country number, and then the third symbol is the district, the fourth is the city or town, and the fifth is a symbol that identifies the creator. It will take a little research, but I can have an answer for you by tomorrow afternoon. Austin looked at his watch. Frank, we have a special mission. Come on, we need to leave in 5 minutes. I will brief you on the way. Austin looked at Dr. Powell, Dr. Clark, and the rest of the SMU agents. I will see you gentlemen tomorrow morning. I suggest that everyone get some sleep. We have a big day tomorrow. Everyone nodded. Oh, Austin, I almost forgot. Agent Acosta took out a small paper bag from his jacket pocket and handed it to Austin. Austin rolled his eyes and made a face. He took the bag and put it in his own jacket pocket. Thanks, Acosta. Frank was busy looking at Dr. Paulo. Austin tapped Frank on the arm. We need to go. Frank nodded and left with Austin. Dr. Paulo shut down the program, took out the microchip and put it in a holder and handed it to Sergeant Cooper. If you would please keep this with you, Sergeant Cooper, I would appreciate if you could help me with my research tomorrow if we have time. Sergeant Cooper took the chip. Yes, sir. Dr. Powell stood up. Thank you for the use of your computer, Sergeant Cooper. Austin led Frank down the hall and took the elevator to the underground parking area where the president's limo was kept. Austin looked out at the parking garage. No one was in sight except for the guard, who was fast asleep at his post. Austin grabbed the limo keys off the hook that was next to the guard, and then he and Frank snuck past him. Austin opened the back door of the limo and motioned for Frank to get in. Frank closed the door almost all the way while Austin let himself into the driver's seat. Once Austin started the limo, the guard woke up and thought that the president must have walked past him while he was asleep. He jumped up out of his chair and stood up so quickly that he knocked the chair over. Austin drove off, and once they were out of sight, Frank opened the back door and closed it all the way. Where are we headed? Frank asked. Austin answered, we are picking up our new president. Frank nodded his head and smiled, and then realized what Austin had just said. What? Austin laughed. You'll see. Austin drove to Arlington and stopped at the guard gate for a very fancy housing tract. He showed his ID to the gate guard. Sayers is expecting us. The guard checked his computer, nodded, and opened the gate. Sayers? Frank sat up straight. Wow. Austin nodded. Yep. Austin drove to Sayers' house and waited in the driveway. A few minutes later, a man in his 70s with white hair and blue eyes looked out of the front window and saw the limousine. A moment later, he left the house and walked over to the limo. Austin got out of the car and opened the back door for President Sayers. This way, Mr. President. Austin looked at President Sayers. He was as impressive up close as people said that he was. Frank smiled at Sayers as soon as Austin closed the door and got back into the driver's seat and started driving. Mr. President, it is good to meet you, sir. I wish that it could have been under better circumstances. Sayers looked at Frank. I don't know. I think that the end of the rule of an evil dictator are rather good circumstances. Frank felt embarrassed. He was impressed with Sayers and grinned. Yes, sir. When you put it that way, they are rather good circumstances. Sayers shook Frank's hand firmly. It's very good to meet you and have you on board, Special Agent Fisher. Agent Lieutenant Miller told me a lot about you. Frank looked at Austin, who glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Austin smiled. All true, too. Frank, there is a mask in the paper bag that I handed you. Please give it to President Sayers. Frank looked confused for a moment and then realized what Austin was talking about. He opened the bag that he had set next to him and took out a latex mask and a wig and handed it to Sayers. Sayers nodded. Frank looked at Austin. Austin grinned. Just a little something that Agent Acosta cooked up before we left California. Frank, help President Sayers with the mask, please. Frank nodded. Sayers slipped the mask over his head. Frank helped to make sure that it was on straight. The mask fit Sayers well. Frank shivered. The mask looked so much like President Paulson that it gave Frank the creeps. Sayers adjusted the black scarf that he had worn, and Frank helped him with the wig. It was a little messy since it had been in the paper bag with the mask, but Sayers fixed it with his fingers enough to make it look real. He had dressed exactly like Paulson, including the black hat that Paulson usually wore when he went out in public. Even their builds and height were similar. Sayers adjusted the black hat and put on dark sunglasses. Austin pulled into the parking garage and parked the limo. The guard was standing at his post. He watched Austin get out of the limo and open the door for Sayers. Frank got out of the car and walked to the left of Sayers while Austin walked to his right. The guard saluted who he thought was President Paulson. Just like Paulson would do, Sayers looked at the guard and walked right past him. Austin and Frank led Sayers to the presidential suite. He looked around the room. Austin closed the door behind them. Don't worry, sir. This room was thoroughly cleaned this afternoon, and fresh sheets, blankets, and a fresh bedspread were also put on the bed, as well as new pillows. The bathroom and shower were thoroughly cleaned as well. Not that Paulson ever showered, Frank thought to himself. Sayers nodded. Austin smiled at Sayers. We'll see you in the morning, sir. Thank you for serving our country once again. Sayers nodded and smiled. My pleasure, Agent Miller. Frank smiled at Sayers. Glad to have you here, sir. Sleep well. You too, Agent Fisher. Austin and Frank left President Sayers, and then Austin showed Frank to his quarters, which were right next to his. Good night, Frank. Sleep well. See you in the morning at 7 a.m. Good night, Austin. Hey, are we supposed to call him President or Interim President? Austin looked at Frank. I believe the correct term is interim president, but I'm not going to call him that to his face. Are you? Frank shook his head. No. There you go. Good night, Frank. See you in the morning." Frank nodded and went into his room and laid on the bed and fell asleep. Austin went to his quarters and went over the next day's plans, and then went to bed. He tossed and turned for a little while before he was finally able to fall asleep. Austin spoke up. "Agent Fields is starting to come to." Dr. Paulo looked at Frank. "Agent Fisher, please help me to untie Agent Fields." Agent Fields opened his eyes and looked at Frank and Dr. Paulo, who were just finishing untying him. "What happened? Why was I in restraints?" Dr. Paulo calmly stated, "We didn't want you to fall off the table while you were out. You and Agent Plum were in a horrible accident. Agent Lieutenant Miller saved your lives." Austin looked at Dr. Paulo and then took a step towards Agent Fields. Agent Fields looked at Frank and then at Dr. Paulo. He tried to sit up. "The last thing that I remember, Agent Plum and I were in the briefing room." Agent Fields suddenly looked wide-eyed. "Is Agent Plum okay?" "Lay back down, Agent Fields. You need rest. Agent Plum will be fine. He got a little more of a shock than you did." Dr. Paulo adjusted the pillow that was under Agent Fields' head. Agent Fields was still somewhat out of it. "A shock? What happened?" Dr. Paulo looked convincingly at Agent Fields. "Somebody booby-trapped the briefing room. If Agent Miller had not acted so quickly and found the transmitter, you and Agent Plum would have been killed." Agent Fields looked over at Austin. "Thank you, Austin." Austin simply nodded his head and then turned and walked away for a moment to compose himself. He was not sure why he had to stifle a laugh. He could not believe what a smooth operator Dr. Paulo was. He would have to fill Philip in, since he had been in the briefing room earlier as well. Austin took a moment and then went back and stood next to Frank. He and Sergeant Cooper had no trouble with Dr. Paulo's half-made-up story. Dr. Paulo was checking Agent Fields' pulse again. Austin looked at the expression on Frank's face and had to excuse himself again. He went over to a water cooler that was across the room and got a drink of water. "I want you to rest in your quarters, Agent Fields. There was no damage to your nervous system due to the shock. I want you to get plenty of rest and drink plenty of fluids." Dr. Paulo looked at Sergeant Cooper. "Would you please get that wheelchair and bring it over here?" Dr. Paulo pointed to a wheelchair that was near the water cooler where Austin was standing. Sergeant Cooper nodded. He walked across the room and got the wheelchair. He looked at Austin. Sergeant Cooper raised his eyebrows and whispered, "I'm glad that Dr. Paulo is on our team." Austin turned and looked over his shoulder at Dr. Paulo, who was checking Agent Fields' pupils. Austin held up his water cup to drink and looked in Sergeant Cooper's eyes. "Is he?" Sergeant Cooper nodded and pushed the wheelchair over to Agent Fields, who was sitting up with the aid of Frank and Dr. Paulo. "There we go. You may feel a little bit shaky, but that will wear off soon," Dr. Paulo said as he and Frank helped him to get off the examining table and into the wheelchair. Austin was starting to feel a little guilty for laughing as he watched Agent Fields, and a little guilty for hurting him. "Sergeant Cooper, would you be so kind as to take Agent Fields to his quarters and stay with him for a couple of hours? Help him to get as comfortable as you can." Dr. Paulo patted Agent Fields' shoulder. Sergeant Cooper nodded. "Yes, sir." Sergeant Cooper wheeled Agent Fields to his room and helped him to get undressed with his underclothes and then helped him to get into bed. He brought him a glass of water and helped him to drink it and then set the glass down on the nightstand. He took a seat in a nearby chair and watched Agent Fields fall asleep. Sergeant Cooper felt moody. They hurt one of their own men. Back in the infirmary, Austin looked at Dr. Paulo. "Do you need any help with Agent Plum, Dr. Paulo?" Dr. Paulo looked at Austin. "No, Agent Miller. I will be fine. I have the equipment in my bag that I can use to reprogram him and erase his memory back until he and Agent Fields were in the main briefing room before the shock. After that, I can untie him. He will do me no harm or anyone else here." Austin nodded at Dr. Paulo and then looked at Frank. Austin looked at Frank. "Come with me. There is something that we need to do before I get Sayers and Mr. King." Frank nodded and followed Austin to his quarters. Austin went to his overnight bag and took out a scrambler and held it up. He looked at Frank. "I think that I know what is wrong with Philip." Frank looked at the scrambler in Austin's hand. "Oh no, don't tell me that he is a hybrid too." Frank shook his head. He liked Agent Adams. Austin looked at Frank. "No, but I think that he thinks that he is." Austin walked off, leaving Frank standing there next to the dresser. Frank snapped out of his semi-trance and followed Austin to Philip's quarters. Austin knocked on Philip's door. "Philip, it's Austin. I have Frank with me." There was no answer. Austin looked at Frank and then knocked again. Finally, Philip came to the door. He looked at Austin and Frank and went back into his room, leaving the door ajar. Austin had never seen Philip so moody before, not even under the worst of circumstances. Philip stood in the middle of the room with his back turned to Austin and Frank. Austin spoke up. Philip, what's wrong? Have you come for me? Philip asked. Come for you. What did you do? Agent Fisher asked. Austin gave Frank a warning look and quietly said, shh. Austin looked at Philip. What's going on, man? Philip turned around and looked at Austin. I'm a hybrid. Frank looked at Austin, who was grinning ear to ear at Philip. Frank seemed confused that Austin was smiling so big. Frank tapped Austin hard on his shoulder using the back of his hand. Austin looked at Frank and held his finger up to Frank and then looked back at Philip. You think that you are a hybrid, or you know that you are a hybrid. Philip shrugged his shoulders and looked at Austin. I don't know, but what if I am a hybrid and I just don't know it? Look at Corporal Faith. He didn't know. Philip looked down at the floor. So Agent Plum really is a hybrid, Philip sighed. How did you guys explain to them what happened to them? Austin looked at Frank and then at Philip. Agent Plum hasn't had that explained to him yet. I suppose he will be told later. And Agent Fields was told that someone had booby-trapped the briefing room and that I disarmed the transmitter and saved their lives. Philip nodded. Who thought of that story? Dr. Powell did. Wow, Dr. Powell was pretty resourceful, Philip felt snubbed. Austin nodded. I knew that we were forgetting something when we planned all this out. I'm glad that Dr. Powell stepped up to the plate, but I am sorry that he made me the hero and not you. Philip studied Austin's expression. What's wrong, Austin? You have that look on your face that says something is fishy. No, not really. I'm just surprised how easily Dr. Powell lied. His expressions and mannerisms and voice were 100% believable. I just have a hard time with someone who can lie and not show one inkling of guilt or emotion while doing it, Austin said. Not even a blink or a flinch. Philip nodded. Do you think that he is untrustworthy? Well, Austin leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. I think that he should be watched and not trusted completely. After all, he was on the other side. Frank spoke up. I think that Dr. Powell has just had to hide his feelings for such a long time while working for President Paulson that he has become accustomed to believing what he says. You know, he has a great poker face. Frank looked at Austin. You seem to have a good gut feeling for people, though. Austin nodded. I like what you said, Frank, and I agree with it. My gut feeling is that Dr. Paulo is a decent guy and a great scientist, but we should still do what we are trained to do and never trust him completely, just like we've been taught. Philip looked at the clock on the wall. Is the 1 p.m. press conference to announce Paulson's death still on schedule? Austin led Mr. King to the president's office. I know Frank said something already, but I need to warn you that Sayers is wearing a mask that makes him look like Paulson. So don't freak out on me when I open this door. Mr. King put his hand on his stomach and nodded. Austin opened the door and Mr. King looked over at Sayers sitting behind Paulson's desk and froze. His expression looked as though he was looking at Paulson's ghost. Austin put his hand on Mr. King and pushed him into the president's office. He walked in behind him and closed the door. Mr. King still had his mouth hanging open and was still staring at Sayers. Frank walked by Mr. King and shook his head slightly and said, I told you not to freak out. Austin looked at Frank and then at Mr. King. Yeah, I had told him that too. Austin slapped Mr. King on the back. Come on, Mr. King, snap out of it. It's a mask. He leaned down and whispered in his ear, look at the eyes. Sayers stood up and walked towards Mr. King and held out his hand. Mr. King took a step back and stepped on Austin's foot. Mr. King, glad to see you again. It's me, President Sayers. Mr. King relaxed the moment that he heard Sayers' voice. Mr. President, my apologies. The mask is so realistic. Sayers laughed. I felt a little unnerved when I looked in the mirror the first several times as well. Come have a seat at the conference table. I heard that is where Paulson collapsed. That's as good a place as they need to do this. Interim President Sayers went over to the briefing table and sat down at the head of the table. Austin had a flashback with Paulson sitting there and everything that happened afterwards. He shivered. Mr. King looked at Sayers and had the same flashback. Yes, sir. Mr. King sat down next to President Sayers. By the way, Mr. King, you did such a phenomenal job with me and my administration that I would like you to stay on. Sayers smiled. Of course, I will be using my own face and not this mask. He pointed at the mask and laughed as an attempt to make a joke. I would like that very much, sir. Austin looked at Sayers and said, Dr. Clark is standing by for Mr. King's phone call. It will take him less than a minute to get here. If I may help you onto the floor, sir, before I leave. Oh, yes, of course. Just in case someone is walking by when he walks in the door, it will make the story more believable if you are on the floor and not sitting in a chair and moving around. Austin's sarcastic sense of humor made Frank need to stifle a laugh. "Let me help you too, sir," Frank said. President Sayers got up and Frank and Austin helped him to sit on the floor next to the briefing table and then helped him to lay down on his back. Sayers looked up at Frank and Austin. "Thank you, gentlemen, for all of your help. I have to tell you that you are two of the smartest agents that I have ever met." "Thank you, sir," Frank smiled. "Thank you, Mr. President." Austin felt humble yet pleased. Frank looked at Mr. King. "You can call Dr. Clark a few minutes after we leave." Mr. King nodded. The stewardess came and stood right next to Frank. "Sir, please, we are ready for takeoff." The blonde-haired woman looked at the stewardess and then at Frank. "Oh, how rude of me, I'm sorry." She set her book and her earbuds down on the armrest and stood up quickly. But the stewardess refused to move, so she and Frank ended up an inch apart from each other, face to face. "Oh," the blonde-haired woman exclaimed. Frank looked at her, and she looked back at him. "Sir, please, you need to take your seat," the stewardess insisted once again. Frank did his best to squeeze by the blonde-haired passenger. Their bodies brushed against each other as Frank maneuvered to squeeze by her. When Frank was standing face to face with her, he got a little nervous, and he tripped over her foot and almost fell forward against her. Not that there was any room to do that. Their eyes met. Frank felt a nice warm feeling in his chest. He was finally able to finish squeezing past her and sat down and buckled his seatbelt. The blonde-haired woman sat back down and rebuckled her seatbelt as well. She looked at Frank and held out her hand. "Hi, I'm Pam. Pam Spears," she smiled. Frank looked at her. She had short blonde hair with bangs that were swept over to the side. She had blue eyes that had no dishonesty in them. Frank shook her hand. "Hi, Pam. I'm Frank Fisher." Frank smiled at her. This was the one. Without a doubt, he knew. Once they were in the air, Pam went back to reading her book, but she did not put the earbuds back in her ear. Pam looked at Frank. "This is my first time in Los Angeles. Can you recommend any good places to eat?" "Yes, I know several places in South City that I can recommend." "Where are you from?" Pam smiled. "I live and work in Washington, D.C. "Small world," Frank smiled. Pam looked at Frank with half a smile and one raised eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Frank's heart filled with humble pride. It was going to feel so good to say this. "I've been working for President Paulson as an SNUA, and I am starting a new assignment at the end of next week as part of interim President Sayers' security team and as part of a special task force." "That is impressive," Pam smiled and then frowned. "Sorry to hear about Paulson, but off the record, I am looking forward to things returning to normal." "And you are right, it is a small world. I have been assigned to work on a special task force myself." Pam smiled and continued talking. "I can't say what it's about, but I can say that it involves working under someone that I have always looked up to and admired greatly." She smiled and made the cutest expression while looking at Frank. "Dr. Albert Howell." Frank almost fell out of his seat. He smiled and blushed a little, and then he gave a quick laugh. Pam looked at him. She studied Frank's face. He was a very handsome man, but it was obvious that he did not have the kind of ego that often goes along with a man that was that handsome. "What's so funny?" Frank looked at Pam and smiled. "I'm on the same task force. That is, assuming that Dr. Paulo is only running one task force." Pam looked at him and tapped his arm playfully. "You're kidding me." Interim President Sayers started the press conference. My fellow Americans, it is with a heavy heart that I bring you the news that this morning President Earl Paulson suffered a heart attack during a meeting with his top aide. His personal physician, Dr. Jeremy Clark, and 2 House EMTs were unable to fully revive him. He was taken to the infirmary where he remained in a semi-comatose state until he had a second heart attack and died. President Earl Paulson was pronounced dead at exactly 11:03 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Sayers continued, "Due to the lack of stability in this country, I have enacted the DOAP 43 Act of 2028 that states," Sayers looked at the document that he was holding and read from it, "If the President shall become ill or deceased or is otherwise unable to carry out his duties as the President of the United States, and the Vice President is ill or deceased or is otherwise unable to carry out or to temporarily take over the duties of acting or interim presidency, the President who most recently held office, if he is fit and able to assume the duties as interim President, he shall therefore assume full responsibility of all presidential duties immediately and until a special presidential election can be held." Sayers put the document back down on the desk. Interim President Sayers looked at the camera. "I am asking each and every American to do their part in this dark time. I am sending a call out to all of the groups and the citizens that are fighting against one another to stop fighting. This is the United States. We need to all work together to stop the civil war that is ravaging our country and get back to the morals and standards that made our country what it is in the first place." Sayers looked right at the camera. "My first act as interim president is to make void the LOTC, also known as the Law of the Constitution, that President Paulson enacted, and to re-establish the real United States Constitution." Sayers tore up a paper that was supposed to be a copy of the LOTC and looked back at the camera. "I will now recite the preamble to the United States Constitution." President Sayers looked directly at the camera and spoke. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America."
want retribution. Oh yeah, we want retribution. Oh yeah, we want retribution. Yeah, we ran out of patience. Boil up with the